They said Duke Damien Blackthorne had ice in his veins and murder in his bloodline. On the night he claimed his unwanted bride, the entire kingdom held its breath, not out of celebration, but out of fear. Clara Vale stood at the altar in a dress that cost more than her ruined family's last 3 years combined, watching a man whose eyes revealed nothing but winter. She had been sold like livestock to save her father's worthless neck, and now she belonged to a stranger famous for destroying anyone foolish enough to cross him. What she didn't know yet was that survival in Blackthorn Manor required more than obedience. It required becoming someone entirely new. Stay with me through this, because what starts as a transaction becomes something far more dangerous, and if you make it to the end, you'll see exactly how two people trapped in hell can either burn together or forge something unbreakable. Let me know what you think when we get there.
Yes, mape.
The carriage wheels hit another rut in the frozen road, and Clara's shoulders slammed against the door frame hard enough to bruise. She didn't make a sound. 3 hours into this nightmare journey, and she had already learned that showing pain was pointless. Her new husband sat across from her in the darkness, a shadow among shadows, and he hadn't spoken a single word since the cathedral doors closed behind them. Clara studied him through the gaps in the curtain where moonlight leaked through. Damien Blackthorne. The most feared man in the kingdom sat with perfect posture despite the violent rocking of the carriage, his gloved hands resting on his knees like he was attending a pleasant garden party instead of traveling through wilderness with a woman he'd been forced to marry. His face was all sharp angles and controlled stillness. Nothing soft about him anywhere. Nothing human. She had expected cruelty at the altar. Maybe violence. Her cousin Margot had whispered terrible stories the night before the wedding. Tales of noble wives who vanished into estates and were never seen again. Of husbands who treated their brides like property to be used and discarded. But Damien had simply looked at her once during the vows with those dead gray eyes, repeated the words the bishop fed him, and slipped a ring onto her finger with the mechanical precision of a man signing a business contract. No kiss, no smile, no acknowledgement that she was even human. The silence pressed against Clara's chest like a physical weight. She had been raised to fill awkward moments with pleasant chatter, to smooth over discomfort with practiced grace. Her mother had drilled it into her from childhood, but something about the way Damien sat there, so utterly self-contained, so completely indifferent to her presence, made all those lessons feel ridiculous. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. Why did you agree to this marriage? Her voice came out smaller than she intended, nearly swallowed by the sound of hooves on frozen ground. For several long seconds she thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then his head turned slightly toward her, and she caught the gleam of his eyes in the darkness. For the same reason you did. Because we had no choice. His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it often. Not cruel exactly, but completely devoid of warmth. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the carriage walls. My father made his choice when he gambled away everything we had. I'm just paying his debts. Then we understand each other. Damien turned his gaze back toward the window. This marriage serves a purpose for both our families. Nothing more. What purpose? Survival. The word hung in the air between them like a blade. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly colder than the temperature could account for. She had known the basic facts, of course. Her father's spectacular financial collapse had been the scandal of the season. Lord Marcus Vale, once a respected merchant with political connections, had destroyed himself through gambling debts owed to men who didn't forgive or forget. The Blackthorne family had stepped in with an offer, absorbed the debts and salvaged what remained of the Vale reputation, in exchange for Clara's hand in marriage to the Duke. A business transaction, nothing personal. But sitting here in the darkness with this silent stranger who now owned her by law, Clara felt the full weight of what she'd actually agreed to. She wasn't a bride. She was currency. A playing piece moved across a board by men who saw her as nothing more than a solution to their problems. How long until we reach Blackthorn Manor? Another hour, perhaps 2. Damien's tone made it clear the conversation was over. He settled back against the seat and closed his eyes, dismissing her completely. Clara watched him for a moment longer, searching for any crack in that controlled facade. Nothing. The man was a wall. She turned toward her own window and stared out at the passing landscape. They had left the city hours ago and now traveled through dense forest, the kind of wilderness where civilized rules started breaking down. Every now and then she caught glimpses of the estate markers, stone pillars carved with the blackthorn seal, a thorned rose wrapped around a sword. Symbols of power and violence, appropriate. The temperature kept dropping as they climbed into higher elevations. Clara pulled her cloak tighter and tried not to think about what waited for her at the end of this journey. A stranger's house, a stranger's bed, a life that no longer belonged to her. Her father hadn't even looked her in the eye during their last conversation. He'd stood in his ransacked study surrounded by empty bottles and unpaid bills, explaining in a voice thick with self-pity why he'd had no choice but to accept the blackthorn offer. They would have killed me, Clara. Do you understand? These men don't negotiate. And what about me? What happens to me? You'll be a duchess. You'll have security, stability. I'll be trapped. He'd finally met her gaze then, and she saw nothing in his eyes but relief. Relief that he had found a way out, that someone else would pay the price for his weakness. You'll survive. That's what we do. Clara pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let herself hate him for just a moment. Pure, clean hatred for the man who'd raised her and then sold her to save himself. It felt good, clarifying. Then she pushed it down and locked it away because hatred wouldn't help her now. She needed to think, to observe, to figure out how to survive in a place where she had no allies and no leverage. The carriage turned sharply and began climbing a steep incline. Through the trees, Clara caught her first glimpse of Blackthorn Manor, and her breath caught despite herself. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. Massive stone walls rose out of the mountainside like they'd been carved from the rock itself, all sharp edges and brutal architecture. Towers jutted toward the sky at irregular angles, crowned with iron spikes. No warmth anywhere in the design, no beauty, just power and intimidation built into every stone. This is where you grew up. She hadn't meant to speak the thought aloud, but Damien opened his eyes and followed her gaze. Yes. And you chose to stay. I didn't choose anything. This place makes you what it needs you to be. The carriage passed through massive iron gates that screamed wealth and warning in equal measure. Clara noticed guards stationed along the walls, armed men who watched their approach with the kind of alertness that suggested they expected trouble. How many enemies did the Blackthorn family have that they needed this kind of security? They rolled to a stop in a courtyard illuminated by torches that cast dancing shadows across the stones. The door opened before Clara could gather herself, and a gloved hand appeared. She looked up to find Damien standing outside, offering assistance with the same mechanical courtesy he'd shown at the altar. His hand was solid and cold even through the layers of fabric between them. He helped her down without a word, and then released her immediately, like touching her was a duty to be completed and forgotten. A severe-looking woman in black emerged from the manor's entrance, followed by a line of servants who moved with military precision. The woman's gaze swept over Clara with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock. Your Grace. The woman offered Damien a shallow bow. Welcome home, Mrs. Thorne. Damien's tone suggested he found the welcome as unnecessary as Clara found it cold. Prepare the Duchess's chambers. She'll want to rest after the journey. Of course. Mrs. Thorne's eyes slid toward Clara, and something flickered there. Not warmth, but calculation. Your Grace, if you'll follow me. Clara glanced at Damien, but he was already turning away, striding toward the manor's entrance with long steps that suggested he had more important matters to attend to. Apparently his responsibilities as a husband ended at delivering her to his house in one piece. Mrs. Thorne led her through corridors that seemed designed to intimidate, high ceilings that swallowed sound, dark wood paneling that absorbed light, portraits of severe-looking Blackthorn ancestors glaring down from the walls like judges at an execution. Everything about this place whispered the same message. You don't belong here. They climbed a staircase wide enough for 6 people to walk abreast, and Clara caught sight of servants pausing in their work to stare at her. Some looked curious, others hostile. None looked friendly. The household has been informed of your arrival. Mrs. Thorne's voice echoed in the vast space. His Grace maintained certain expectations regarding order and discretion. I trust you'll acquaint yourself with the manor's routines quickly. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning. What kind of routines? Meals are served at precise times. His Grace dines alone in his study. You'll take your meals in the smaller dining room unless specifically invited otherwise. The Duke values his privacy and expects the same courtesy from household members. Clara stopped walking. So I'm a household member now, not his wife. Mrs. Thorne turned to face her fully, and Clara saw something almost like pity flash across those hard features before disappearing. You're whatever His Grace needs you to be. My advice is to make that as simple as possible. They reached a door at the end of a long hallway, and Mrs. Thorne pushed it open to reveal what Clara supposed was meant to be her sanctuary. The room was enormous, easily 3 times the size of her childhood bedroom, but somehow managed to feel suffocating anyway. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. Dark furniture crouched against darker walls. A massive bed dominated the center of the space, draped in fabrics that probably cost more than her father's remaining assets. Everything a duchess could want. Mrs. Thorne gestured around the room. Your belongings will arrive tomorrow. Ring if you need anything. She left before Clara could respond, pulling the door shut with a soft click that sounded far too much like a cell locking. Clara stood in the center of that expensive prison and felt the full weight of her situation settle over her like a burial shroud. This was her life now. This cold room in this fortress of a house, married to a man who looked at her like she was furniture. Expected to be grateful for the privilege of being sold. She moved to the window and pulled back the curtain. The view looked out over the estate grounds stretching toward distant mountains. Beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. No warmth anywhere, just like everything else in this place. A knock at the door startled her. Come in. A young maid entered carrying a tray, her eyes downcast. Your supper, Your Grace. Clara wasn't hungry, but she thanked the girl anyway, watching her set down the tray with trembling hands. The maid looked terrified. What's your name? The girl's eyes widened like she hadn't expected to be spoken to. Anne, Your Grace. How long have you worked here, Anne? 3 years, Your Grace. The girl kept her gaze fixed on the floor. Since I was 14. Is it always this quiet? Anne hesitated, and Clara caught something that looked like genuine fear cross her face. His Grace prefers order, Your Grace. We've learned not to disturb it. The maid practically fled after that, leaving Clara alone with a meal she couldn't bring herself to eat. She sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything. The fear in that young girl's eyes, the warning in Mrs. Thorne's words, the complete absence of anything remotely resembling warmth or welcome. What kind of man inspired that level of fear in his own household? Hours passed. Clara watched the light fade outside her window and tried not to think about what came next. Her mother had given her a mortifying talk before the wedding about wifely duties and expectations. Clara had been dreading that particular nightmare since the moment the marriage was arranged. But night fell completely, and no one came. She waited in that enormous room, jumping at every sound in the hallway, but her door never opened. Eventually, exhaustion overtook anxiety, and she undressed herself. There was apparently no lady's maid assigned to her, and climbed into the massive bed. The sheets were expensive and cold against her skin. Clara lay there in the darkness and felt tears leak from the corners of her eyes, even though she'd promised herself she wouldn't cry. Crying was weakness. Crying meant letting them win. But God, she was tired of being strong. She must have eventually slept because she woke to gray morning light filtering through the curtains and a sound that took her several seconds to identify. Voices. Raised voices somewhere in the manor, sharp with argument. Clara slipped from the bed and crossed to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. The voices were too distant to make out words, but she could hear the tone clearly enough. Anger, accusation. And underneath it all, one voice that cut through the others like a blade, cold and controlled and absolutely merciless. Damien. Curiosity overrode caution. Clara wrapped herself in a robe and eased the door open, following the sounds through the maze of hallways. She stayed close to the walls, moving as quietly as possible. The voices grew louder as she approached what must be a main hall or gathering room. A door stood slightly ajar ahead, and Clara crept close enough to peer through the gap. What she saw made her breath catch. Damien stood in the center of a room full of hostile faces, men and women in expensive clothes who radiated wealth and entitlement. His relatives, Clara realized, the extended Blackthorn family, and every single one of them looked ready for blood. You had no right to make this decision without consulting the family council. The speaker was an older man with silver hair and a face full of barely contained rage. This marriage affects all of us. I don't require permission from the council to choose my own wife. Damien's voice was quieter than the others, but somehow more dangerous. The matter is settled. Nothing is settled. A woman with sharp features and expensive jewelry stepped forward. You've brought an outsider into this house.
given her access to family resources, all to satisfy some political arrangement with the Vales, a family of gamblers and cowards. Watch your tone, Cousin Millicent.
Or what? She moved closer, and Clara saw the family resemblance in her cold eyes. You'll throw us out the way you've thrown out everyone who questions you. You forget that this estate, this fortune, it belongs to the Blackthorn bloodline, not just you. I forget nothing. Damien's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness made the room go quiet. The bloodline, the fortune, the legacy. I've heard these speeches before, usually from people who want control without responsibility. We want what's rightfully ours. You want what you haven't earned. Damien moved, and the crowd actually stepped back. My father built this estate into what it is through ruthless business decisions and strategic alliances. I've maintained that power by being even more ruthless when necessary. None of you have contributed anything except demands and complaints. That's not. The marriage stands. Clara Vale is now the Duchess of Blackthorn, and she will be treated with the respect that title commands. Anyone who has a problem with that can leave. Permanently. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara watched the family members exchange glances, saw the calculations happening behind their eyes. They hated him. Every single person in that room looked at Damien like they wanted him dead, and he stood there completely unfazed, like their hatred was just another weather condition to be endured. This isn't over. The silver-haired man gathered himself with visible effort. The council will meet and discuss this properly. With or without you, feel free. Damien turned away, dismissing them all. My decision won't change. He strode toward the door, toward Clara, and she barely had time to step back into the shadows before he emerged. For one terrible second, she thought he would look her direction and discover her eavesdropping, but he walked past without a glance, his face carved from stone. The family members filed out after him, still muttering among themselves. Clara waited until the hallway cleared before slipping back toward her room, her mind racing. That confrontation had revealed more about her new husband in 5 minutes than their entire wedding day. Damien wasn't just cold. He was isolated, surrounded by enemies even within his own family, and he ruled through fear and absolute control because that was apparently the only language these people understood. She thought about the way they'd looked at him, the barely concealed hatred, the frustration of people who wanted power they couldn't claim, and she thought about what Damien had said. The marriage stands. She will be treated with respect. He'd defended her. Not out of affection, there was nothing in his voice to suggest he felt anything for her at all, but he'd drawn a line and made it clear that anyone who crossed it would face consequences. Clara wasn't sure if that made her safer or just a more valuable target. She made it back to her room without being seen and found breakfast waiting. Apparently Anne had come and gone while she was spying. Clara picked at the food and tried to make sense of her situation. The day stretched ahead with nothing to fill it. No one came to give her instructions or show her around the estate. No one explained what was expected of her. She was just here, existing in a gilded cage while life happened around her. By afternoon, she couldn't stand the isolation anymore. Clara dressed carefully in one of the few outfits she'd brought from home and ventured out into the manor, determined to at least learn the layout of her new prison. The place was even more massive than she'd realized. Endless corridors branched off in all directions, rooms upon rooms, most closed and locked. She passed servants who quickly averted their eyes and hurried away like being seen by her was dangerous. Clara found a library by accident and spent an hour exploring shelves full of books that looked like they'd never been read. Military history, political theory, financial treatises. Nothing soft anywhere, nothing human. She was examining a particularly vicious-looking text on medieval warfare strategies when she heard footsteps behind her. The Duchess explores. Clara spun to find a man leaning against the doorframe, watching her with open amusement. He was younger than Damien, mid-20s maybe, with the same sharp blackthorn features but less control. His smile was easy and dangerous. I was just looking around. Clara closed the book carefully. I'm sorry if I'm somewhere I shouldn't be.
You're the Duchess. Technically, everything here belongs to you now. The man pushed off the doorframe and strolled into the library like he owned it, though I wonder if anyone bothered to explain what that actually means in this family. You have me at a disadvantage, Sebastian Blackthorn. The man offered a mocking bow. Damien's cousin, also his business partner, occasional advisor, and perpetual disappointment to the family council. Pleasure to meet you. Is it? Sebastian studied her with eyes that were sharp despite the casual tone. Most people find the Blackthorn family tree more curse than pleasure. I'm married into it now. Might as well make the best of things. Pragmatic. Sebastian smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's good. You'll need that here. Tell me, Clara, may I call you Clara? What did my dear cousin tell you about this marriage? About what he expects from you? Not much. Clara chose her words carefully. He mentioned it was a business arrangement. Sebastian laughed, sharp and bitter. A business arrangement? Of course he did. Classic Damien. All transaction, no humanity. You sound like you don't approve. I sound like someone who's watched my cousin turn himself into a walking fortress. Sebastian moved closer, and Clara fought the urge to step back. He wasn't raised to be warm, you understand. Our family beat that out of him years ago, but he used to at least pretend to feel things. Now he's just ice. Why are you telling me this? Because someone should warn you. Sebastian's smile faded, and for just a moment Clara saw something genuine beneath the charm. This family destroys people, especially people who get too close to power. My cousin has enemies, Clara, real ones, and now you're married to him, which makes you a target whether you realize it or not. A chill ran down Clara's spine. What kind of enemies? The kind who see an opportunity in a new duchess with no protection and no understanding of how things work here. Sebastian held her gaze. Be careful who you trust, including me. He left before she could respond, disappearing into the corridors as easily as he'd appeared. Clara stood alone in the library, her heart pounding. Be careful who you trust. The warning echoed in her mind as she made her way back to her room, suddenly aware of every shadow and every closed door. Sebastian had confirmed what she'd already suspected. She was in danger here, real danger. And the man she'd married cared only enough to defend his own authority, not to actually protect her. Dinner arrived in her room again that night. No invitation to join Damien or anyone else, just more isolation. Clara ate alone and wondered how long she could survive like this. How long before the loneliness and fear broke her down into something that couldn't fight back anymore. 3 days passed in the same pattern. Isolation. Silence. Fear. She explored the manor when she dared, avoided the hostile family members when she couldn't, and spent her nights in that enormous bed wondering if this was really her life now. On the 4th day, everything changed. Clara was descending a staircase near the main hall when she heard voices again. Different ones this time, servants, whispering urgently. Did you see it? The tea service in her Grace's room. What about it? The cup was wrong. Sarah swears she brought the Duchess's preferred blend, but someone switched it afterward. That's never happened before. Clara moved closer, staying out of sight. Switched it how? I don't know, but Mrs. Thorne was furious. She's having all the kitchen staff questioned. The servants moved away, still muttering. Clara stood frozen on the stairs, her mind racing. Someone had tampered with her tea. The implication was clear enough. The warning Sebastian had given her suddenly felt far more immediate. She was being targeted, maybe tested, maybe something worse. Clara's hands were shaking as she continued down the stairs. She needed to talk to someone, to report this. But who? Mrs. Thorne apparently already knew. And Damien? She hadn't seen her husband since the wedding night. He might as well have been a ghost for all the presence he had in her life. But someone had tried to poison her, or at least send a message. And Clara was damned if she was going to just sit in her room and wait for the next attempt. She found Mrs. Thorne in the housekeeper's office, bent over ledgers. The woman looked up with barely concealed irritation. Your Grace, something you need. I heard about the tea. Clara closed the door behind her. What happened? Mrs. Thorne's expression tightened. Nothing for you to concern yourself with. A simple mix-up in the kitchen. That's not what the servant said. Someone deliberately switched what was brought to my room. The housekeeper stood slowly. You've been eavesdropping on staff conversations. I've been trying to understand what kind of house I'm living in. Clara held her ground despite the woman's intimidating stare. Someone is trying to hurt me. I want to know who. You want to know? Mrs. Thorne moved around the desk. You've been here 4 days and you think you have a right to demand answers. I have a right not to be poisoned in my own home. Your home. Something flickered across Mrs. Thorne's face, contempt, barely disguised. You're a girl who was sold to settle debts.
This place will chew you up and spit you out before you even understand what's happening. My advice is to stay in your room, keep your head down, and pray you survive long enough to become irrelevant." Clara felt anger rising, hot and bright. "Is that what you told the last Duchess?" Mrs. Thorne went very still. "Excuse me, I've seen the portraits. Damien was married before." "What happened to her?" The silence stretched between them, charged with danger. When Mrs. Thorne finally spoke, her voice was ice. "She died. That's all you need to know. How? That's not your concern. It's very much my concern if someone in this house is targeting—" The door slammed open and Clara jumped back, startled. Damien filled the doorway, his expression carved from fury. "Mrs. Thorne, out." The housekeeper fled without a word, leaving Clara alone with her husband. He closed the door with careful control and turned those cold gray eyes on her. "You're investigating household matters. Someone tried to poison me. Someone made a mistake in the kitchen." Damien's voice was flat. "It's been handled." "Has it?" Clara felt the fear trying to choke her, but she pushed through it. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your family wants me dead, and you don't particularly care as long as it doesn't interfere with your routine." Something shifted in Damien's expression, still cold, but sharper now. Focused. "You think I don't care? You haven't spoken to me in 4 days. You leave me in that room with no protection, no information, no way to defend myself. What am I supposed to think? You're supposed to stay out of sight until the family adjusts to your presence." Damien moved closer and Clara backed up against the desk. "I brought you here to satisfy a political obligation, not to become a target. Too late. I'm already a target. They won't touch you." "How can you know that?" "Because I'll destroy anyone who tries." The words came out quiet and absolute. Clara stared at him, searching for any hint of emotion behind that controlled facade. She found nothing but cold certainty. "You don't even know me. I know you're under my protection. That's enough." "Protection." Clara laughed, sharp and bitter. "I've been alone in that room for days while people whisper about me in hallways and servants tamper with my food. That's not protection. That's abandonment." Damien studied her for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, still controlled, but with an edge underneath. "You want to know why I kept my distance? Fine. Every person in this family is watching to see how I treat you, watching for weakness, for favoritism, for any sign that you matter more than the political arrangement we both know this is. The moment they see affection, they'll use you against me. So you keep me isolated instead. I keep you safe, by making me irrelevant, by making you difficult to leverage." Damien's jaw tightened. "You don't understand this family, Clara. You don't understand what they're capable of when they smell opportunity. Then explain it to me. Let me understand instead of leaving me in the dark. Knowledge makes you more dangerous, not less." "I'm already in danger." The tea proved that. Silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Clara watched emotions flicker across Damien's face. Frustration, calculation, something that might have been concern if she believed he was capable of it. Finally, he moved to the window and stood with his back to her, staring out at the estate grounds. "My father built this fortune through ruthless business practices and strategic cruelty. He taught me early that mercy was a weakness, that caring about anyone made you vulnerable, that the only way to survive in this family was to become harder than everyone around you." Clara waited, sensing there was more. "When I was 12, I tried to protect someone. A servant girl who was being mistreated by my uncle." Damien's voice had gone flat in a way that suggested he was reading from a script he'd memorized long ago. "My father found out. He had the girl dismissed and made sure I understood that my kindness had destroyed her life more completely than my uncle's cruelty ever could have. The lesson was clear. Care about nothing. Trust no one. Survive. That's horrible. That's reality." Damien turned back to face her. "Every soft thing in this house gets crushed eventually. I learned to stop being soft. And what about your first wife?" She met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away. Damien's expression closed down even further, if that was possible. "That's not a topic for discussion. She died in this house. I think I deserve to know what happened." "You deserve nothing except what I choose to tell you." Damien's voice had gone cold again. "Dangerous. My first marriage is none of your concern. Learn that boundary quickly." He left before Clara could respond, the door closing behind him with finality. She stood there shaking,
from anger or fear or maybe both, and tried to process what had just happened.
Damien had shown her a glimpse beneath the ice, a glimpse of the boy who'd learned to shut down every human instinct in order to survive. And then he'd slammed that door closed again so hard she could practically hear it lock. But she'd also seen something else in his eyes when he promised to destroy anyone who tried to hurt her. Something fierce and possessive that had nothing to do with political arrangements. He meant it. Whatever his reasons, Damien actually intended to protect her. The question was whether that protection would be enough when the real attack came. Clara returned to her room feeling unsettled in ways she couldn't quite name. She'd pushed her husband and gotten a reaction, not warmth, not kindness, but at least acknowledgement that she existed beyond being a chess piece. It was something. Maybe not much, but more than she'd had yesterday. That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about the girl Damien had tried to protect when he was 12. Thinking about his first wife who died under circumstances he refused to discuss. Thinking about all the servants who moved through this house with their eyes downcast and fear built into their postures. What kind of place destroyed people so completely that even the Duke had learned to shut down his humanity just to survive? Clara was still awake when she heard the sound. Soft at first, almost imperceptible. But growing louder, footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Slow footsteps, deliberate. They stopped right outside her room. Clara held her breath, heart pounding. The door handle turned and she watched in frozen horror as the door began to open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the hallway darkness. The figure stepped inside and closed the door softly behind them, and Clara opened her mouth to scream. The scream died in Clara's throat before it could escape. The figure moved fast, too fast for her panic to catch up, and a hand clamped over her mouth. Not rough, almost careful, but absolutely firm. Don't. The voice was low and familiar. It's me, Damien. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. It was him. Her husband stood beside her bed in shirt sleeves and dark trousers, his hand still covering her mouth, his face close enough that she could feel his breath against her cheek. He removed his hand slowly, watching her face for signs she might scream anyway. "What are you doing in my room? Keeping you alive." Damien stepped back and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look out. "Get dressed. Quickly." "What?" "Someone's in the East Wing. They shouldn't be." His voice was controlled, but Clara caught the edge underneath it. Controlled fury. "We're leaving this room. Now." Clara's mind raced through a dozen questions, but the look on Damien's face killed them all. She scrambled out of bed and grabbed the first dress her hands found, pulling it on over her nightgown with shaking fingers. No time for propriety or modesty. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to bring her husband to her door in the middle of the night. "Where are we going? Somewhere they can't reach you." "Who's they?" "Later." Damien crossed to the door and listened for a moment before opening it carefully. "Stay behind me. Don't speak. Don't run unless I tell you to." He moved into the hallway like a predator, silent and absolutely focused. Clara followed, her bare feet cold against the stone floor. The manor felt different at night, more menacing. Shadows pooled in corners and doorways like living things waiting to strike. They navigated through corridors Clara didn't recognize, moving deeper into the estate's interior. Damien stopped at intersections to listen before proceeding, his hand occasionally reaching back to ensure she was still there. The touch was brief and impersonal, but Clara found herself oddly reassured by it anyway. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Damien stopped at a section of wood paneling that looked identical to everything else around it. He pressed something Clara couldn't see, and the panel swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Inside. Clara hesitated. Every instinct screamed that following a man she barely knew into a hidden passage was monumentally stupid. But the alternative was staying alone in hallways where unknown enemies were hunting. She stepped through the opening and Damien followed, pulling the panel closed behind them. The darkness was absolute for several seconds before he struck a match and lit a small lantern hanging on the wall. Weak light spilled across narrow stone steps leading down. What is this place? An escape route. My father had several built into the manor's design. Damien started descending and Clara followed, one hand trailing along the cold stone wall for balance. He didn't trust his own family even then. Smart man, paranoid man. But in this family, there's not much difference. They reached the bottom of the stairs and entered a small room carved directly from bedrock. Sparse furnishings, a desk, 2 chairs, a narrow cot against one wall, papers scattered across the desk surface, a weapons rack holding knives and a pistol. This wasn't just an escape route. It was a safe room, a place to hide and plan. Damien set the lantern on the desk and finally looked at her directly. His face in the flickering light was all sharp angles and controlled tension. Tell me everything you heard tonight, every sound, every detail. I heard footsteps. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how thin her dress was. In the hallway outside my room, they stopped at my door. Before that, any voices? Movement elsewhere in the manor. Clara thought back, forcing herself past the panic. I don't know, maybe. I thought I heard something earlier, but I assumed it was servants. What kind of something? Voices. Arguing, maybe, but far away. Clara met his gaze. What's happening? My cousin Sebastian is missing. Damien's tone was flat, but Clara caught the significance anyway. He was supposed to report to me this evening about security protocols. He didn't show. His rooms are empty. You think he's involved? I think someone paid him to leave his post. Damien moved to the weapons rack and checked the pistol with practiced efficiency. Sebastian is many things, but he's not stupid enough to directly attack you, which means whoever hired him wants the opening his absence creates. To get to me. Yes. Why? Clara heard her voice rising and fought to control it. I'm nobody. I have no power here. What possible threat could I be to anyone? Damien turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her breath catch. In the lantern light, his eyes looked less cold and more haunted. You're a variable no one can predict. You weren't raised in this family. You don't understand the alliances or the blood feuds or the careful balance of power that keeps this estate from tearing itself apart. That makes you dangerous precisely because you're innocent. That's insane. That's survival. Damien set the pistol down. My family operates on a simple principle. Eliminate threats before they become problems. Right now, you're an unknown. Some of them want to study you, figure out how to use you. Others want you gone before you can interfere with their plans. What plans? The ones that involve removing me from power and dividing the estate among themselves. Damien's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing dinner arrangements instead of assassination plots. I've held them off through force and intimidation, but bringing you here shifted the dynamic. They see weakness, an emotional attachment they can exploit. You barely look at me. I know. His jaw tightened. That's by design. But they also know that if something happens to you while you're under my protection, it damages my reputation, makes me look weak, and weakness in this family is a death sentence. Clara sank into one of the chairs, her legs suddenly unreliable. So I'm bait, a test to see if you'll break your own rules. You're a complication I didn't fully anticipate. Damien moved to the desk and started sorting through papers with focused intensity. I thought the marriage announcement would be enough. A clear signal that you're protected by law and family obligation. I underestimated how desperate some of them have become. Desperate for what? Money? Power. Freedom from my control. Damien pulled out what looked like a ledger and flipped it open. My father left the estate to me entirely, not split among his children or shared with extended family, just me, which means everyone else is dependent on my goodwill for their allowances and positions. They hate it. So they want to kill me to hurt you. They want to create chaos, force me into making mistakes. Damien looked up and met her eyes. And if you die in the process, that's just efficient planning. The casual way he said it made Clara's stomach turn. How long have you known this was coming? Since the wedding. I increased security. Had Mrs. Thorne monitor the staff for any unusual behavior. Kept you isolated to limit access points. But Sebastian's disappearance means someone made a move I didn't anticipate. You could have warned me. What would that have accomplished? Damien's voice hardened. You'd have been terrified and useless. At least this way you stayed calm enough to notice the footsteps. I deserve to know when my life is in danger. Everyone's life in this house is always in danger. That's not information. That's just reality. Clara stood up fast enough to make the chair scrape against stone. You're unbelievable. You bring me into this nightmare, surround me with people who want me dead, and you think keeping me ignorant is protection. Ignorance is safer than knowledge when you don't know who to trust with what you learn. I could have trusted you. Could you? Damien stepped closer and Clara held her ground, even though every instinct screamed to back away. You don't know me, Clara. You don't know what I'm capable of or what lines I've already crossed to maintain control. For all you know, I'm the most dangerous person in this entire manor. Are you? The question hung between them, charged with something Clara couldn't name. Damien studied her face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. I'm the only person here who has a vested interest in keeping you alive. Whether that makes me dangerous or safe is something you'll have to decide for yourself. Why? Clara heard the desperation creeping into her voice. Why do you care if I live or die? You said yourself this marriage is just politics because letting them win is not an option. Damien's eyes had gone cold again. Controlled. And because you're mine by law. I don't give up what belongs to me. I'm not property. In this family, everyone is property. The only question is who owns you. Damien turned back to his papers. Right now, that's me. Be grateful. Grateful. Clara laughed, sharp and bitter. For being trapped in a safe room while murderers search for me upstairs. For having a husband who sees me as a possession. For being sold into this hell by my own father. Yes, I'm overflowing with gratitude. Self-pity doesn't suit you. Neither does being treated like livestock. Damien's hand slammed down on the desk hard enough to make the lantern jump. The sound echoed in the small space, and Clara flinched despite herself. When he spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. You want honesty? Fine. You're right. I don't see you as a person. I see you as a responsibility. Something I have to keep alive because the alternative is admitting defeat to people who've been trying to destroy me since I was old enough to understand what power meant. That's all you are to me. A symbol. A piece on a board I can't afford to lose. The words hit like physical blows. Clara felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart exactly, because she'd never been naive enough to believe Damien cared about her. But some last stupid hope that maybe underneath the ice there was something human. Then why? Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Why fight so hard to protect a symbol? Because I don't lose. Ever. Damien's expression was carved from stone. That's the only rule that matters. Silence fell between them, heavy with anger and resentment, and something else Clara couldn't identify. She stared at this man she'd married, this stranger who'd just admitted he saw her as nothing more than a game piece, and felt exhaustion crash over her like a wave. How long do we stay here? Until morning. Damien moved to the cot and sat down, his back against the wall. Then we go back upstairs and I deal with whoever made this move. Deal with how. However necessary. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting. Damien closed his eyes. Try to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be difficult. Clara wanted to argue, to demand real answers, to scream at him for his cold brutality. But what was the point? He'd been perfectly clear about what she meant to him. Nothing. Just a piece he couldn't afford to lose without looking weak. She lowered herself into the other chair and pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. The stone room was cold, and the lantern cast dancing shadows across the walls. Clara watched Damien sitting there with his eyes closed and wondered how anyone became this empty, this controlled. Hours crawled past. Clara dozed fitfully, jerking awake every time her head dropped forward. Damien didn't move, didn't sleep as far as she could tell, just sat there like a statue carved from ice. Finally, the first hints of dawn must have reached the outside world because Damien opened his eyes and stood in one smooth motion. Time to go back? What if they're still waiting? They won't be. Damien collected the pistol and tucked it into his waistband. Whoever it was came for a quick strike. When that failed, they retreated to avoid being caught. Now they'll regroup and try a different approach. How do you know that? Because that's what I would do. He led her back up the narrow stairs and through the hidden panel into the main manor. Everything looked normal in the gray morning light. Servants moving through their routines. No signs of violence or intrusion. But something felt different. Clara caught the looks that followed them as they walked through the corridors, quick glances from maids and footmen that held calculation instead of simple curiosity. They know something happened. Of course they know. Damien's voice was low. Half these servants report to various family members. By noon, everyone in the estate will have heard about our midnight disappearance. And what will they think? Whatever I want them to think. He walked her to her room and paused at the door. His face in the morning light looked tired. Still controlled, still cold, but something underneath the ice suggested he hadn't slept in days. Stay here today. Mrs. Thorne will bring your meals. Don't answer the door for anyone else. I'm a prisoner again. You're protected. There's a difference. Clara laughed without humor. Not from where I'm standing. Damien studied her for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, still controlled, but with an edge of something that might have been regret if she believed he was capable of it. I didn't ask for this marriage any more than you did, but we're both trapped in it now. The best we can do is survive until it becomes bearable, and if it never becomes bearable, then we survive anyway. That's what we do. He left before she could respond. Clara entered her room and closed the door, leaning against it as exhaustion finally caught up with her. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body felt like it had been through a war. She'd survived the night, barely. But Damien's words kept echoing in her mind. You're mine by law. I don't give up what belongs to me. Not affection, not protection born from caring, just pure possessive pride that wouldn't tolerate anyone taking his property. Clara moved to the window and stared out at the estate grounds. Somewhere out there were people who wanted her dead, and somewhere in this manor was a husband who saw her as nothing more than a symbol he couldn't afford to lose. She was completely alone. The day dragged past in isolation. Mrs. Thorne brought meals and removed them untouched. Clara couldn't eat, couldn't focus, just paced her room and jumped at every sound in the hallway. Evening was falling when she heard the commotion, raised voices, multiple people arguing somewhere in the manor. Clara crept to her door and eased it open a crack, listening. The voices were coming from the direction of the main hall, angry voices, accusations flying. She caught fragments as servants hurried past. Found him in the east wing. Denies everything but the evidence. His Grace is furious. Clara's curiosity overrode her caution. She slipped into the hallway and followed the sounds, staying close to the walls. Other people were converging on the main hall too, servants and family members drawn by the drama. She reached a position where she could see into the hall without being immediately visible. What she saw made her breath catch. Sebastian stood in the center of the room, his usual easy charm completely gone. His face was bruised, his hands bound behind his back, and surrounding him were Damien and at least a dozen family members, all watching with predatory interest. I told you, Sebastian's voice was ragged. I was meeting someone. A business contact, that's all. At 3 a.m. In a section of the manor you had no reason to be in. Damien's voice was cold as winter. Try again. I'm telling the truth. The truth is, you were paid to create an opening. Damien circled him slowly. Someone wanted access to the Duchess's wing. You took money to ensure that access happened. That's insane. Who would pay me to do that? That's what we're going to find out. Damien nodded to someone Clara couldn't see. 2 men stepped forward. Guards, she realized. Not household staff. Private security. Search his rooms. Bring me everything. Letters, ledgers, anything that doesn't belong. The guards left. Sebastian tried to maintain his composure, but Clara saw fear creeping into his eyes. Damien, cousin. This is a misunderstanding. Is it? Damien stopped directly in front of him. Because from where I'm standing, you deliberately abandoned your security post on the same night someone tried to reach my wife's room. That's not a misunderstanding. That's conspiracy. I would never... You would do exactly that if the price was right. Damien's voice had gone quiet. Dangerous. We both know your loyalty extends exactly as far as your bank account. The guards returned carrying a wooden box. They set it on a table and opened it, revealing papers and a leather pouch heavy with coins. Damien examined the contents in silence while the room watched. Finally, he held up a letter. Clara couldn't see what it said, but she saw Sebastian's face go pale. Care to explain this? I don't know what that is. It's a contract, Damien read aloud. Payment for services rendered. Specifically, ensuring the East Wing remains unguarded between midnight and 3 a.m. on the night of the 23rd. That was last night, Sebastian. The room erupted in whispers. Family members exchanging glances. Servants backing away from Sebastian like he carried plague. Someone set me up. Sebastian's voice had risen with desperation. Planted that box in my room to make me look guilty. Convenient excuse. It's the truth. The truth is you sold me out for money. Damien's control finally cracked, and Clara saw pure rage flash across his face. You endangered my wife, compromised the security of this entire estate. For what? A few £1,000s. I didn't... Who paid you? Silence. Who paid you? Sebastian's shoulders sagged. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I don't know. The contact was anonymous. Money delivered with instructions. I never met them face to face. How convenient. Damien turned to address the room. Let this be a lesson to anyone else considering similar arrangements. Betrayal in this family has consequences. He drew the pistol from his waistband, the same one Clara had seen in the safe room, and pressed it against Sebastian's temple. The room went absolutely silent. Damien. The silver-haired man from before stepped forward carefully. You can't just execute him. There are laws, procedures. Family law says I can do whatever necessary to protect the estate. Damien didn't move the gun. Sebastian betrayed that trust. The penalty is clear. He's your blood, which makes the betrayal worse. Clara watched in frozen horror as Damien's finger moved to the trigger. Sebastian had gone completely still, his eyes closed, waiting for the shot. But it didn't come. Instead, Damien lowered the pistol and stepped back. You're banished. Effective immediately. You have 1 hour to gather personal belongings. Anything else remains property of the estate. If you're found within 50 miles of Blackthorn Manor after sunset, my guards have orders to kill you on sight. Sebastian's eyes opened, shock and relief warring on his face. You're letting me live. I'm sending you a message. Damien's voice was ice. The next person who tries this won't be so fortunate. He gestured and the guards hauled Sebastian away. The family members dispersed quickly, muttering among themselves. Clara stayed hidden in her alcove, her heart pounding. She'd just watched her husband almost commit murder in cold blood. And the only thing that had stopped him was strategy, not mercy. The hall emptied except for Damien standing alone in the center of the space. He stood there for several minutes, completely still. Then his shoulders dropped slightly, and he dragged one hand across his face in a gesture of pure exhaustion. For just a moment, he looked human, lost, like the weight of what he'd almost done was finally hitting him. Then the moment passed and his spine straightened. The mask slid back into place. When he turned toward the exit, his expression was carved from stone again. Clara pressed herself deeper into the shadows as he passed, afraid to breathe. He walked by without noticing her, lost in whatever calculations were running through his mind. She waited until he was completely gone before slipping back to her room on shaking legs. What she'd witnessed changed everything. Damien wasn't just cold. He was dangerous, willing to kill his own cousin over betrayal. Only strategic thinking had saved Sebastian's life. The recognition that execution would cause more problems than it solved. But he'd been ready to pull that trigger. Clara had seen it in his eyes. No hesitation, no remorse. Just cold calculation about whether the benefits outweighed the cost. This was the man she was married to. This was the man whose protection she depended on for survival. Clara barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Damien's face as he pressed the gun against Sebastian's temple, saw the absolute certainty in his expression, the complete absence of doubt. Morning arrived, and with it came Mrs. Thorne carrying breakfast. His Grace requests your presence in his study. 1 hour. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. Clara dressed carefully, choosing one of her more conservative gowns. Armor of respectability. She had no idea what Damien wanted, but after last night she wasn't taking any chances. A servant escorted her through the manor to a section she'd never visited. They stopped at a heavy oak door, and the servant knocked once before opening it. Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackthorn. Clara stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with ominous finality. Damien's study was exactly what she would have expected. Dark wood, leather furniture, walls lined with books about military strategy and financial dominance. A massive desk covered in papers and ledgers. No personal touches anywhere. No photographs or mementos. Just tools for maintaining control. Damien stood at the window with his back to her, staring out at the grounds. He didn't turn when she entered. You watched last night. It wasn't a question. Clara's heart sank. Of course he'd known she was there. Yes. And what did you learn? That you're willing to kill your own family. That I'm willing to do whatever necessary to protect what's mine. Damien finally turned to face her. Sebastian's betrayal could have gotten you killed. The penalty for that is death. I showed mercy only because executing him would have triggered a blood feud with his mother's side of the family. Strategy, not sentiment. You're telling me this why? Because you need to understand the reality of your situation. Damien moved to his desk and sat down, gesturing for her to take the chair across from him.
Last night's attack failed, but there will be others. Whoever paid Sebastian is still out there, still planning, and you're still the target. So what do? We change the dynamic. Damien pulled out a document and slid it across the desk. You're going to start attending family functions, dinners, meetings, public appearances. I want everyone to see you at my side. That makes me more visible, more vulnerable. It makes you real instead of theoretical. Right now you're an unknown, a ghost bride locked in a tower. That makes you easy to target because no one thinks of you as an actual person. But if they see you regularly, hear you speak, watch you interact with me, it becomes harder to justify killing you. You're using me as bait. I'm using you as a deterrent. There's a difference. Clara stared at the document without touching it. What's this? A new will. If anything happens to me, you inherit the estate entirely. Not my cousins, not the family council. You. Why would you do that? Because it removes their incentive to kill you and frame it as an accident. Damien leaned back in his chair. If you die while I'm alive, the estate stays with me. But if they kill me and you survive, they get nothing. It creates a stalemate. Everyone has to keep both of us alive to have any chance at inheritance. That's clever. That's survival. Clara finally picked up the document and scanned it. The legal language was dense, but the intent was clear. Damien was tying their fates together so completely that attacking one became strategically pointless. What if we both die? Then the estate gets liquidated and distributed to charity. My final revenge. Damien's smile was cold. They all know this. The will is already filed with my solicitor. By dinner tonight, the entire family will understand the new rules. And you think this will stop them? I think this will force them to be more creative, which gives us time to identify who's actually behind these attacks and remove them permanently. Remove them how? The same way I would have removed Sebastian if strategy hadn't intervened. Clara set the document down carefully. You're asking me to participate in a plan that ends with you killing members of your own family. I'm telling you that's the plan whether you participate or not. The question is whether you want to have any agency in your own survival or just remain a passive victim waiting for the next attack. The words stung because they were true. Sitting in her room hiding hadn't kept her safe. Trusting Damien to handle everything hadn't prevented last night's attempt. If she wanted to survive, she needed to stop being helpless. But God, the cost of that survival felt steep. What do you need me to do? Attend tonight's dinner. Damien stood and moved back to the window. The family council is meeting to discuss security measures after Sebastian's banishment. I want you there. Visible. Calm. Every inch the Duchess they can't afford to eliminate. And if they try something anyway. Then we find out who's desperate enough to make a move even with the new will in place. Damien glanced back at her. That level of desperation is useful information. You're willing to risk my life for information. I'm willing to use calculated risk to flush out enemies. You're already at risk, Clara. At least this way we gain something from it. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was insane for thinking she'd just walk into a room full of people who wanted her dead. But what alternative did she have? Run back to her father who'd sold her in the first place. Try to escape an estate surrounded by guards and wilderness. Beg for mercy from a husband who'd already made clear he had none to give. The only way out was through. Fine. I'll attend your dinner, but I want something in return. Damien raised an eyebrow. You're negotiating. You said I could choose to have agency. This is me choosing. What do you want? Information. Clara stood and faced him directly. Tell me what happened to your first wife. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Damien's expression went completely cold. That's not negotiable. Then neither is my cooperation. They stared at each other across the study. Two people locked in a battle neither could afford to lose. Claire's heart was pounding, but she kept her face neutral. She needed this, needed to understand what she was dealing with. Finally, Damien spoke, his voice flat and emotionless. Her name was Elizabeth. We were married for 6 months. She died in a fall from the North Tower. Clara waited, but he didn't continue. That's all you're going to tell me. That's all that matters. How did she fall? The official investigation said accident, and the unofficial truth. Damien's jaw tightened. Stays unofficial. Did you kill her? The question hung in the air like poison. For several long seconds, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, no. But I might as well have. What does that mean? It means Elizabeth was too soft for this family,
too trusting. She believed people were inherently good. That kindness could change them. Damien's voice had gone distant, like he was reading from a script. She tried to make friends with my cousins, trusted the wrong person with information she shouldn't have shared. When they used that information against her, it destroyed her, so she killed herself. The investigators called it an accident. Damien met her eyes. I know better. And you've spent the last however many years making sure no one gets close enough to hurt you again. I've spent the last 3 years ensuring that what happened to Elizabeth never happens to anyone else under my protection. Even if that means becoming the monster everyone already thinks I am. Clara felt something shift in her understanding of this man. He wasn't cold because he lacked feelings. He was cold because feeling had cost him someone he'd cared about. The ice was armor, protection against a family that weaponized every soft thing they found. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but she meant them anyway. Don't be. Damien turned back to the window, dismissing her. Elizabeth's death taught me the most important lesson of my life. In this family, caring about someone makes you weak, and weakness gets people killed. Is that why you keep me at a distance? That's why I keep everyone at a distance. Clara stood there for a moment longer, staring at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders, the controlled stillness that never broke. She was starting to understand that Damien Blackthorne wasn't her enemy. He was a prisoner of the same system that had trapped her. The difference was he'd been here long enough to learn all the survival strategies, long enough to cut away everything human to avoid giving his enemies leverage. No wonder he saw her as a symbol instead of a person. Seeing her as human would mean acknowledging she could be hurt, used against him, destroyed the way Elizabeth had been destroyed. I'll see you at dinner. Clara moved toward the door. And Damien, thank you for telling me. He didn't respond, just stood there at the window like a statue carved from ice and regret. Clara left his study with her mind churning. Tonight she'd face the entire family council knowing they wanted her dead, knowing that her survival depended on convincing them she was more valuable alive than murdered. The girl her father had sold to settle his debts wouldn't have been able to do that. But Clara was discovering that being trapped in hell changed you, made you harder, more ruthless. Maybe that's what Damien had meant about survival. You either adapted to the brutality around you, or you got crushed by it. There was no middle ground. Clara returned to her room and began preparing. Not just her appearance, but her strategy. If she was going to walk into that dinner and survive it, she needed to become someone else, someone who could match these people's cruelty with strength, their manipulation with intelligence. She needed to stop being a victim and start being a player in this deadly game. The Duchess in the mirror that evening looked different than the scared girl who'd arrived at Blackthorne Manor 2 weeks ago. Her dress was expensive and perfectly fitted, her hair arranged with severe elegance, her face a mask of cold composure. She looked like she belonged here, like she was dangerous. Good. A knock at her door announced it was time. Clara took one last steadying breath and opened it to find Damien waiting. He'd changed into formal evening wear, all black except for a deep red vest that made him look even more intimidating. His eyes swept over her appearance and something flickered in his expression too quickly to identify. Ready, as I'll ever be. Remember, you're the Duchess. Act like you own the room because legally you do. Half that estate is yours now. And if someone attacks me anyway, then I'll kill them before dessert is served. Damien offered his arm. Shall we? Clara took it, and they walked through the manor together, a unified front heading into battle. Servants stopped to stare as they passed. Word had clearly spread about the new will, about what it meant. The Blackthorne power structure had just been fundamentally altered, and everyone in this house knew it. They reached the dining hall and paused outside the massive doors. Clara could hear voices beyond. The family council already gathered and waiting. Last chance to run. Damien's voice was low. Once we walk through those doors, there's no going back. You'll be declaring yourself part of this family's politics. Clara squeezed his arm once. Then she let go and straightened her spine. Open the doors. Damien's smile was cold and approving. He gestured to the servants and the doors swung wide. Every face in that room turned toward them. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Clara felt the weight of their collective hatred and calculation like a physical force. But she didn't falter, didn't look away. She walked into that room like she owned it, like she was every inch the Duchess they couldn't afford to kill. And somewhere in that moment, between one step and the next, Clara Vale stopped being a victim. She became something far more dangerous. A player who had nothing left to lose. The dining hall stretched before Clara like a battlefield dressed in crystal and silver. 23 members of the Blackthorn Family Council occupied seats along a table that could have hosted 50, their positions clearly strategic rather than social. The older generation clustered near the head where Damien would sit. The younger relatives spread out like sentries watching for weakness. And in the gaps between them sat empty chairs that felt more like traps than invitations. Clara felt every eye track her movement as she walked beside Damien toward the head of the table. Not curious glances. Predatory assessment. The kind of attention that calculated value and vulnerability in the same cold sweep. Damien pulled out a chair for her, the seat immediately to his right, and Clara sat with practiced grace she'd learned from childhood etiquette lessons that now felt like combat training. The silk of her dress whispered against the chair, expensive fabric hiding the tension coiled in every muscle. The silver-haired man from the family confrontation sat directly across from her. He studied Clara with eyes that had seen decades of Blackthorn brutality and learned to recognize which players would survive and which would be consumed. Cousin Millicent occupied a seat 3 down from Damien's left, her jewelry catching lamplight like small weapons. The sharp-featured woman who'd called Clara's family gamblers and cowards. Her expression now held something worse than contempt. It held patience. The look of someone who knew victory was only a matter of time. A younger man Clara didn't recognize sat beside Millicent, too handsome in a way that seemed deliberately cultivated. His smile when he caught Clara's gaze was warm and entirely false. Damien remained standing until everyone settled. Then he took his seat and the servants began bringing courses with military precision. No one spoke. The silence pressed against Clara's chest like a physical weight. She'd expected accusations or hostile questions. Instead, the family ate in coordinated quiet, every movement controlled, every bite measured. This wasn't dinner. It was a demonstration of discipline. Finally, the silver-haired man set down his fork with deliberate care. So, the new arrangements. His voice carried across the table despite its moderate volume. Clara felt the room's attention sharpen. Damien didn't look up from his plate. What about them? We're concerned. The old man's tone suggested concern was a polite fiction covering something far less civilized. The new will creates certain complications regarding estate succession. It creates certainty. Damien cut into his meat with precise strokes. Something this family has lacked for too long. It creates a situation where an outsider could inherit everything. Millicent leaned forward slightly. Forgive us for finding that troubling. Then don't kill me. Clara heard herself speak before conscious thought caught up. Her voice came out steady, almost bored. Problem solved. The room went absolutely still. Damien's knife paused mid-cut. He glanced at Clara with an expression that might have been approval or might have been warning. Impossible to tell. Bold words from someone who barely understands what she's inherited. The handsome young man smiled wider. I'm Robert, by the way. We haven't been properly introduced. Robert Blackthorn manages our textile imports. Damien resumed cutting his meat, and has aspirations beyond his current position. Ambition isn't a crime in this family. Robert's smile never wavered. It's practically a requirement. Ambition without capability is just arrogance. Damien took a bite. We have enough of that already. The insult landed with surgical precision. Robert's smile tightened fractionally, but held. Clara watched the exchange and recognized the pattern. This wasn't conversation. It was dominance games played out in pleasantries and carefully chosen words. Perhaps the Duchess could share her perspective. The silver-haired man turned his attention fully to Clara. You've been here 2 weeks. What do you make of Blackthorn Manor? Clara set down her fork and met his gaze directly. She'd learned something important in Damien's study earlier. These people respected strength and despised weakness. Hesitation would mark her as prey. I think this family confuses cruelty with power, Clara kept her voice level. You've built an empire on fear and manipulation. It's impressive in its brutality, but it's also fragile. One strong wind and the whole structure collapses. The silence that followed was different, charged, dangerous. Interesting assessment. The old man's eyes glittered. And what would you propose instead? I wouldn't presume to propose anything. I'm just an outsider who was sold to settle debts. Clara picked up her wine glass. But I've noticed that people who rule through fear spend all their energy maintaining that fear. Eventually, they run out of energy. And then they fall. You speak from experience. Millicent's voice dripped acid. I speak from observation. Clara sipped her wine. My father destroyed himself through weakness. Your family is destroying itself through strength. Different methods, same result. She felt Damien's gaze on her but didn't look his direction. She'd crossed some invisible line and couldn't retreat now even if she wanted to. The only option was to keep pushing forward and hope she survived what came next. The Duchess has opinions. Robert leaned back in his chair. How refreshing. Most people spend their first month here learning to keep their mouths shut. Most people value survival over honesty. Clara met his false smile with one equally manufactured. I'm still deciding which I prefer. A sound escaped from somewhere down the table. Laughter. Quickly suppressed but unmistakable. Clara glanced over to find a woman perhaps 10 years older than her struggling to maintain composure. Their eyes met briefly, and Clara caught something unexpected. Recognition. Maybe even respect. Then the moment passed and the woman's face returned to neutral. Dinner continued through multiple courses. The conversation stayed surface level after that. Business updates and estate management discussions that Clara couldn't follow. But she felt the shift in how people looked at her. She'd gone from irrelevant ghost bride to acknowledged threat. Whether that made her safer or more vulnerable remained to be seen. Dessert arrived as the tension finally started to ease. Clara allowed herself to relax fractionally. She'd survived the first test. That's when everything went wrong. A servant approached Damien with a sealed letter on a silver tray. He broke the seal and read in silence while the table watched. Clara saw his expression shift, subtle but unmistakable. Something in the letter had rattled him. When? His voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. 2 hours ago, Your Grace, the servant's hands trembled. We received word immediately, but you were already— Get out. The servant fled. Damien stood abruptly, and every person at the table went rigid with attention. This dinner is over. Leave. Now. The family members exchanged glances, but no one argued. They filed out with controlled efficiency, taking their curiosity and calculation with them. Within minutes, the dining hall was empty, except for Clara and Damien. What happened? Fire. Damien's jaw was tight enough to crack stone. The Western warehouse. Someone torched it an hour before sunset. The one with the textile shipments. Among other things. Damien moved to the window overlooking the estate grounds. Clara could see distant orange glow against the night sky. 3 months of inventory. Gone. Clara stood and approached carefully. How much is that worth? Money isn't the point. Damien's reflection in the glass looked carved from ice. That warehouse was supposed to be secure, protected. Someone got past my guards and burned it to the ground. That's not about profit. That's a message. What message? That I'm vulnerable, that my control is slipping. Damien turned from the window, and Clara saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Genuine fear beneath the cold control. Whoever orchestrated this wants the family to know I can't protect what's mine. You think it's connected to the attack on me. I think someone is making multiple moves simultaneously, testing defenses, creating chaos. He moved past her toward the door. Stay here. Don't leave this room until I return. Where are you going? To find out who's trying to destroy me before they succeed. He was gone before Clara could respond. She stood alone in the massive dining hall surrounded by half-eaten meals and expensive crystal, listening to distant shouts as the household mobilized to deal with the fire. The smart move would be obeying Damien's order. Stay put, stay safe. But Clara was tired of being smart and terrified, tired of waiting for protection that came with strings attached. If someone was making moves against Damien, that meant they were making moves against her too, and she'd rather see the blade coming than wait for it to find her back. She slipped out of the dining hall and navigated toward the western wing, where she could see fire glow through windows. Servants rushed past carrying water buckets. Guards shouted orders. Everything was controlled chaos. Clara stayed to the edges and made her way to a window with clear sight lines. The warehouse was completely engulfed, flames reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. Men formed bucket brigades, but it was obviously too late. The building was lost. She was watching the futile rescue attempts when a hand closed around her arm and pulled her backward into shadows. Clara's scream died as a palm covered her mouth. She struggled, but whoever held her was strong and knew exactly how to control her movement. Stop fighting. The voice was female, low and urgent. I'm not here to hurt you. The hand lifted from Claire's mouth. She spun to find the woman from dinner, the one who'd laughed at her comment about honesty versus survival. Up close, she looked worn down by years of Blackthorn politics, tired in a way that went bone deep. "Who are you?" "Catherine. I'm married to Richard Blackthorn, Damien's uncle." The woman glanced toward the hallway. "We don't have much time. I need to tell you something. Then tell me. That fire wasn't random." Catherine's eyes held genuine fear. It was set by someone inside the family, someone with access to guard schedules and warehouse security protocols. "Do you know who?" "I know it's connected to something bigger." Catherine gripped Clara's arm. "There's a faction within the family council planning to remove Damien from power, permanently. They've been building momentum for months. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you remind me of myself 20 years ago." Catherine's smile was bitter. Fresh blood brought in to strengthen alliances. Used as a pawn. "I learned too late that staying silent doesn't keep you safe. It just makes you complicit in your own destruction." "What do they want?" "The estate. The fortune. Everything Damien controls." Catherine released Clara's arm. "They're planning to orchestrate his death and frame it as an accident or natural causes, then claim the inheritance before the new will can be enforced. But the will leaves everything to me if Damien dies. Only if you're alive to inherit." Catherine's expression made Clara's blood run cold. "They're planning to kill both of you, make it look like a murder-suicide. The grief-stricken Duke kills his young wife, then takes his own life. Tragic, but believable." Clara's mind raced. When? Soon. Catherine glanced toward the window where fire still raged. The warehouse fire is a distraction. While everyone focuses on that, the real attack is being prepared. "Where?" "I don't know. I only overheard fragments of the plan." Catherine started backing away. "They're meeting tonight after the fire is contained, in the old chapel. That's all I know." "Wait," Clara reached for her. "Come with me. We'll tell Damien together." "I can't." Catherine shook her head. "If they know I warned you, my husband will kill me himself. I've already risked too much." "Then how do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know this isn't part of their plan?" "You don't." Catherine disappeared into the shadows. "That's the gamble. Trust the warning or ignore it. Either way, you'll know soon enough if I was lying." She vanished before Clara could follow, leaving Clara alone with information that could be salvation or trap. Catherine had seemed genuine, scared, but this family specialized in performance, in manipulation. Clara pressed against the wall and tried to think through the panic. If Catherine was telling the truth, then Clara and Damien were walking targets. But if this was misdirection designed to make them paranoid and reactive, then acting on false intelligence could be exactly what their enemies wanted. The smart move would be finding Damien immediately and sharing what she'd learned, but something Catherine said kept echoing in her mind. They're meeting tonight, in the old chapel. If there really was a conspiracy, that meeting would be proof. Real evidence instead of warnings from a stranger who disappeared into darkness. Clara made a decision that was probably suicidal. She was going to find that chapel and see for herself who attended. It took 20 minutes of searching and 2 wrong turns before Clara found what she was looking for. The old chapel sat in the manor's east wing, a section that looked abandoned based on the dust and cobwebs. The door stood slightly ajar, lamplight leaking through the gap. Clara crept close enough to hear voices and pressed herself against the wall beside the entrance. Complete disaster. That was Robert's voice, stripped of its charming veneer. The fire was supposed to draw him out where we could take him. Instead, he's locked down the entire estate. Then we adjust. Millicent's cold tones. The fire accomplished what we needed. It proved he can't protect his own assets. Proving weakness isn't the same as removing him. A third voice Clara didn't recognize. "We need him dead, not embarrassed. Patience." The silver-haired man spoke with absolute authority. "Everything is proceeding according to schedule. The fire tonight. The attack on the Duchess last week. Each incident erodes confidence in Damien's leadership." Clara's breath caught. These were the people plotting against them. Catherine had told the truth. "The Duchess is the weak point. Robert again. If we eliminate her, Damien becomes unstable, emotional. That's when we strike." "No!" Millicent's voice was sharp. "We follow the plan. Both of them die together. The murder-suicide narrative only works if the bodies are found in the right configuration." Claire's hands started shaking. She'd heard enough. More than enough.
She needed to get this information to Damien before the floor creaked beneath her foot. The sound was tiny, but in the chapel's silence it might as well have been a gunshot. The voices stopped mid-conversation. Clara ran. She heard shouts behind her, footsteps pounding in pursuit. She sprinted through the abandoned wing without direction, just desperate need to escape. The manor had become a maze of hostile corridors and dead ends. She rounded a corner and slammed directly into someone. Strong hands caught her before she could fall, and Clara looked up into Damien's face. "What are you doing here?" His voice was hard. "I told you to stay in the dining hall." "They're coming!" Clara grabbed his shirt. "The conspiracy." "It's real. I heard them planning. Who's real?" "What conspiracy?" But the pursuit had caught up. Robert emerged from the corridor first, his handsome face twisted with fury. Behind him came Millicent and the silver-haired man and half a dozen others Clara didn't recognize. They spread out in a semicircle, blocking escape routes. Damien shifted to put himself between Clara and the group, his hand moving toward the pistol he always carried. "Uncle Marcus." His voice went cold, addressing the silver-haired man. "Care to explain why you're chasing my wife through the manor at midnight?" Marcus's expression didn't change. "Care to explain why she was eavesdropping on a private family meeting?" "What meeting?" "One that doesn't concern you." Millicent's smile was sharp. "Though apparently your little bride has been busier than we realized." Clara felt Damien's body go rigid with controlled rage. "Whatever you're planning ends now. All of you return to your rooms and we'll discuss this in the morning." "I don't think so." Robert pulled out a pistol of his own. "We're done taking orders from you, cousin." The air went electric with violence waiting to happen. Clara counted the weapons pointed at them. At least 4 pistols. Probably more concealed. Damien was fast and ruthless, but even he couldn't survive those odds. "You're actually doing this." Damien's voice held something that might have been disappointment if he were capable of it. "You're committing treason against your own blood. We're reclaiming what you stole." Marcus stepped forward. "Your father gave you everything, left the rest of us to fight for scraps. That ends tonight. So what's your plan?" "Kill us both here. Claim we attacked you first." Damien's hand stayed near his pistol but didn't draw. "The servants will talk. The guards will investigate. The servants are loyal to whoever pays them, and the guards answer to me now." Marcus's smile was colder than any expression Clara had seen on Damien's face. "You've been so focused on external threats, you missed the rot inside your own house. You can't possibly believe this will work." "It's already working." Millicent gestured and 2 more men appeared from side corridors, both armed. "We control the estate guards, the household staff. Even Mrs. Thorne has been convinced that change would benefit everyone." Clara felt Damien's shock in the way his breathing changed. Carefully controlled, but faster. Mrs. Thorne had been his father's housekeeper for decades. If she'd turned against him, then the betrayal ran deeper than either of them had realized. "So what now?" Damien's voice was flat. "You shoot us and claim self-defense. Actually, we have something more elegant planned." Robert's false smile returned. "A tragic accident. The Duke and Duchess caught in the warehouse fire while investigating the damage. Their bodies burned beyond recognition. So very sad. No one will believe that. Everyone will believe it." Marcus pulled out a document. "We have letters in your handwriting discussing marital problems. Witnesses who will testify to arguments. Evidence of your growing instability. When you're found dead together, it will look like a murder-suicide. Or perhaps a desperate attempt to fake your deaths and escape that went wrong." Clara's mind raced through scenarios. They were trapped, outnumbered, and surrounded. Even if Damien could take down 2 or 3 before they shot him, the rest would kill them both. Unless... She thought about everything she'd learned in 2 weeks at Blackthorn Manor, about survival and strategy and the brutal calculus of power, about how showing weakness could be its own kind of weapon. "Stop." Clara stepped forward before Damien could grab her back. "I'll make you a deal." The conspirators exchanged glances. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You're not in a position to negotiate." "I'm in the perfect position." Clara forced her voice steady, even though terror threatened to choke her. "You want Damien's power. I want to live. Those goals don't have to conflict." "Clara, don't." Damien's voice was low and dangerous. She ignored him. "You're right that killing both of us creates complications. Too many questions. Too much scrutiny. But if Damien dies and I survive, the estate passes to me by law. And I'm just a frightened girl who knows nothing about running a business empire." "Clara." Damien's hand closed around her wrist. Stop talking. She pulled free. I'll sign over control to a family council. Let you manage everything while I collect a modest allowance and stay out of politics. You get what you want. I get to live. Everyone wins. You're actually offering to betray your husband. Millicent looked intrigued despite herself. I'm offering to survive. Clara met her gaze directly. Damien made it clear I'm just a transaction, a piece on his board. Why should I die for someone who never saw me as human? The words came out bitter and real because part of them was true. Clara felt Damien go very still beside her. An interesting proposal. Marcus studied her with calculation. But how do we trust you won't change your mind once you inherit? Draw up whatever legal documents you want. Clara kept pushing even though her heart was breaking. I'll sign them tonight, witnessed and sealed. I'm nobody in this family. I have no allies and no leverage. What am I going to do? Fight all of you alone? Damien's hand found her wrist again and squeezed hard enough to bruise. His voice when he spoke was colder than she'd ever heard it. You're actually doing this, selling me out to save yourself. I learned from the best. Clara forced herself to look at him. You taught me that survival matters more than loyalty, that caring about people makes you weak. Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or rage. Impossible to tell through the ice. I was wrong about you. His voice could have frozen blood. You're not soft. You're just like them. He released her wrist like she'd burned him and stepped back, creating distance. Claire wanted to scream that this was strategy, not betrayal, that she was buying time and looking for any opening to turn this around. But she couldn't say that with enemies listening, so she stood there and let Damien believe she'd chosen her own survival over his life. The look in his eyes when he understood what she was offering would haunt her forever. Not anger, not even betrayal, just complete emptiness, like she'd confirmed something he'd always suspected about human nature. Well, Marcus broke the silence. This is an unexpected development. Give us a moment to discuss. The conspirators huddled together, voices low. Clara risked a glance at Damien and found him staring at the floor. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clenched into fists. He looked like a man who'd just watched his last hope die. Clara wanted to reach for him, to explain, but any sign of connection would destroy the illusion she was building. So she stood apart and silent and hated herself for the necessary cruelty. The conspirators broke their huddle. Marcus approached with document and pen. Very well, we accept your terms. Sign this and we'll allow you to witness Damien's death. Then you inherit and immediately transfer all business decisions to a council of our choosing. Clara took the pen with steady hands, even though everything inside her screamed to run. She read the document quickly. It was exactly what Marcus described. A complete surrender of power in exchange for her life. She signed it. Damien made a sound that might have been bitter laughter. Of course you did. I should have expected this. Don't take it personally. Claire handed the document back to Marcus. You said yourself I'm just a symbol. Symbols don't have loyalty. True enough. Marcus folded the document carefully. Well then, let's get this over with. Robert and two others grabbed Damien. He didn't resist, just stood there with empty eyes as they bound his hands behind his back. The fight had gone out of him completely. Clara watched and felt something crack in her chest. She'd broken him more thoroughly than any physical attack could have. Proven that everyone he'd ever trusted would eventually choose themselves over him, just like his father had taught him, just like Elizabeth's death had confirmed. They started moving him toward the door, toward whatever execution they'd planned, and Clara made her move. She grabbed the pistol from Robert's belt in one smooth motion and fired directly into the ceiling. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Everyone froze. Get away from him. Clara's hands were shaking, but she kept the weapon trained on Marcus. Now. You foolish girl. Millicent started forward. You just signed your own death warrant. Maybe. Clara cocked the pistol. But I'm taking at least 3 of you with me, starting with Marcus. Then you, Millicent. Then Robert. After that, we'll see how brave the rest of you feel. The conspirators spread out, hands moving toward weapons. Clara backed up until she felt Damien behind her. She pressed the pistol against his bonds and pulled the trigger. The rope fell away. His hands came free and suddenly everything changed. Damien moved like violence given human form. He had Robert's throat in one hand before anyone could react, the other hand twisting the man's pistol from nerveless fingers. 2 shots rang out. 2 conspirators dropped.
Clara fired at Millicent's weapon hand. The woman screamed, and the pistol clattered to the floor. Damien shot Marcus in the leg, and the old man crumpled. The remaining conspirators fled. Damien let them go. He stood there breathing hard, covered in blood that might have been his own or someone else's. His eyes found Clara's across the chaos. "You lied!" His voice was raw. "The whole thing was an act." "Yes. You let me believe you'd betrayed me. I had to make it real." Clara lowered her pistol with shaking hands. They wouldn't have accepted the deal if they sensed deception. Damien stared at her like he was seeing someone entirely new. Clara stared back and saw the same recognition happening in reverse. They'd both been playing roles, both been hiding who they really were. The masks were finally off. Marcus groaned from the floor, clutching his bleeding leg. Damien walked over and pressed his boot against the wound. The old man screamed, "You have 10 seconds to tell me everyone involved in this conspiracy." Damien's voice was completely calm. 10 seconds before I decide your death should be much slower." Clara watched her husband torture information from his own uncle and felt nothing. No horror, no disgust, just cold acceptance that this was who Damien had to be to survive. Who she would have to become if she wanted to survive beside him. Marcus talked. Gave up names and details between screams. 18 family members total, all plotting together, all ready to kill for power. When the confession ended, Damien looked at Clara. "What do you want me to do with them?" She understood what he was really asking. This was the moment that would define everything that came after. Show mercy, and they'd be seen as weak. Show cruelty, and they'd become exactly what the family already believed them to be. There was no good choice, only survival. "Make it clear what happens to traitors." Clara's voice came out steady. "But keep them alive, broken and public. I want everyone in this family to see the cost of betrayal." Damien's expression shifted. Something that might have been respect, might have been recognition of a kindred spirit. He pulled Marcus to his feet with brutal efficiency. By morning, everyone involved in this conspiracy would be ruined, stripped of titles and allowances, cast out with nothing. Public humiliation instead of quiet execution. More cruel in some ways, more merciful in others. The sun was rising when they finally returned to the main manor. Damien gave orders to guards who'd remained loyal. Arrests were made, assets frozen. The Blackthorn family council would wake to find their world fundamentally altered. Clara stood in Damien's study while he cleaned blood from his hands. Neither of them had spoken since leaving the chapel. The silence felt different now. Not hostile, just exhausted. "You saved my life." Damien's voice was quiet. "After everything I put you through, after treating you like property, you saved mine first." Clara moved to the window. "Multiple times. I just returned the favor. That's not why you did it." "No." Clara turned to face him. Damien stood there looking more human than she'd ever seen him. Tired, uncertain. The ice finally cracked enough to show what lived underneath. "Why then?" "Because somewhere in the last 2 weeks, I stopped seeing you as my captor and started seeing you as the only person in this nightmare who might actually keep me alive long enough to matter." Clara's voice caught. "And because when I watched them drag you toward execution, I realized I'd rather die fighting beside you than survive alone. That's not logical. Since when is survival logical?" Damien crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into a kiss that tasted like desperation and blood and relief. Clara kissed him back with everything she had, all the fear and fury and terrible understanding that they were both too damaged for normal love, but maybe broken enough to fit together anyway. When they finally broke apart, Damien rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this, how to care about someone without it becoming a weapon." "Then we learn together." Clara's hands shook against his chest. "Because I don't know how to survive this family without you." The admission hung between them, fragile and terrifying. They'd both spent weeks building walls, and now those walls were rubble. "What happens now?" Damien's voice was rough. "Now we rebuild." Clara pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "We clean out the traitors. We secure our position. We become exactly dangerous enough that no one dares try this again. And then maybe we figure out how to be human again, if that's still possible." Damien's smile was bitter. "I'm not sure I remember how." "Neither do I." Clara smiled back. "I guess we'll have to remind each other." They stood there as dawn light filled the study, 2 people who'd been ground down by cruelty until they'd become cruel themselves. But somewhere in that darkness, they'd found each other. Not through romance or grand gestures, through shared survival and the brutal recognition that they were equally matched in their damage. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever in any recognizable form. But it was partnership. Alliance. Two players who'd decided they were stronger together than separate. And in the Blackthorne family, that counted for everything. The door burst open and Mrs. Thorne entered, her face pale. Your Grace, the guards have completed the arrest, but there's a problem. What problem? Your father. Mrs. Thorne looked at Clara. Lord Marcus Vale. He's here. He's demanding to see you immediately, and he's brought men. Armed men. Clara felt ice flood her veins. Her father, the man who'd sold her to settle debts, who'd abandoned her to this nightmare. He'd come back. And he'd brought weapons. Damien's hand found hers and squeezed. We handle this together. Clara squeezed back and nodded. Whatever her father wanted, whatever new betrayal he'd planned, she wouldn't face it alone. She'd become someone different in these 2 weeks. Someone harder, more ruthless. Someone who could stand beside a man like Damien Blackthorne and match his brutality with her own. The girl who'd arrived at Blackthorne Manor as frightened bride was gone. In her place stood a duchess who'd learned that survival required becoming the monster everyone feared, and she was just getting started. Clara's father stood in the main hall like a man who'd forgotten he'd already lost everything worth keeping. Lord Marcus Vale looked worse than she remembered, thinner, with the kind of desperation that clung to failed gamblers like a second skin. But he'd brought muscle. 8 men flanked him, hired thugs with weapons poorly concealed beneath cheap coats. Not soldiers, just desperate men taking money from someone more desperate. The morning sun streaming through the hall's tall windows made the whole scene feel surreal. Outside, guards were still processing arrested conspirators. Inside, a new threat had walked through the front door while everyone was distracted. Damien's gaze stayed on Clara's lower back as they descended the main staircase together. A united front. His other hand rested near the pistol at his waist, with the casual readiness of someone who'd learned violence was always one breath away. Father, Clara kept her voice level, this is unexpected. Is it? Marcus Vale's laugh was bitter. My daughter disappears into this fortress. I hear rumors of assassination attempts and family purges. You think I wouldn't come to ensure your safety? Your concern is touching. Clara stopped 3 steps from the bottom, maintaining the high ground. Particularly since the last time we spoke, you were explaining why selling me was your only option. I had debts, Clara, debts that would have gotten me killed. And now you have armed men in my home. Damien's voice cut through the hall like a blade. Uninvited. Threatening. Care to explain before I have my guards remove you permanently? Marcus's eyes narrowed as he studied Damien, the famous Duke Blackthorne, the man who bought my daughter like livestock. I settled your debts. Damien descended the final steps with predatory grace. That's more than you deserved. You exploited my desperation. I gave you a way out. That you chose to squander it gambling again isn't my problem. Clara saw her father's face flush with rage and humiliation. She'd seen that look before, right before he'd throw something or storm out of rooms trailing destruction. But this time he had backup. 8 men with weapons. And whatever plan had brought him here wasn't about rescuing her. I'm here to collect what's owed to me. Marcus straightened his spine like a man trying to appear taller than his failures. The marriage contract stated a yearly allowance to the Vale family. I haven't received a single payment, because the contract stated payments begin after the first year of marriage. Damien's tone suggested he was explaining basic arithmetic to a child. We've been married 2 weeks. I need those funds now. Then you should have negotiated better terms. The thug shifted positions, hands moving toward concealed weapons. Clara felt tension coil through the hall like a living thing. She counted exits and calculated odds. Damien's guards were throughout the manor, but most were occupied with the conspiracy arrests. The 8 men her father brought could do significant damage before help arrived. This is pointless. Clara stepped forward before violence could erupt. Father, you're desperate and making terrible decisions. Again. Leave now and I'll convince Damien to advance you a portion of next year's allowance. Stay and you'll regret it. Don't lecture me, girl. Marcus's voice rose. I'm still your father. You owe me respect. I owe you nothing. Clara's words came out colder than she intended. You sold me, abandoned me. And now you show up with hired muscle demanding money you haven't earned. That's not a father. That's a parasite. The slap came fast. Clara's head snapped sideways and pain exploded across her cheek. She tasted blood where her teeth cut into the inside of her mouth. Damien moved before Marcus's hand had fully dropped. He caught Clara's father by the throat and slammed him against the nearest wall hard enough to crack stone. The thug surged forward but stopped when Damien pressed his pistol under Marcus's chin. Touch her again, and I'll paint this hall with your brain. Damien's voice was absolutely calm, completely controlled, and more terrifying because of it. The hired men drew weapons. Clara pulled her own pistol, the one she'd taken from Robert last night and hadn't bothered returning. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Nobody moves. She trained her weapon on the nearest thug. My father just committed assault against a duchess in her own home. The penalty for that is death. The only question is whether the rest of you want to die defending him. The men exchanged glances. Loyalty bought with money was always fragile, especially when the price suddenly included their lives. Put down your weapons and leave. Clara's finger moved to the trigger. You have 10 seconds. You can't be serious. Marcus choked the words out around Damien's grip. I'm your father. You stopped being my father the moment you handed me over to settle your debts. Clara met his eyes and saw genuine shock that she'd become someone capable of this coldness. Now you're just a problem to be solved. The thugs lowered their weapons slowly. One by one they backed toward the door, hands visible, eyes tracking both pistols trained on them. Smart men who recognized when a job wasn't worth dying for. Marcus struggled against Damien's hold but couldn't break free. His face was turning purple, eyes bulging with rage and fear. Damien, Clara's voice was quiet. Let him breathe. Why? Damien didn't ease his grip. He struck you. That warrants execution, because I want him to understand what he's lost before he leaves. Something in her tone made Damien's eyes shift toward her. He loosened his hold fractionally, enough for Marcus to gasp air. Clara approached her father and studied the pathetic man who'd shaped her childhood. She'd spent years trying to earn his approval, his pride, some acknowledgement that she mattered beyond her value in marriage negotiations. And standing here now, seeing him desperate and broken, she felt nothing. Not anger, not pity, just cold assessment of a threat that needed neutralizing. You came here thinking you still had leverage over me. Clara's voice was conversational, clinical. That I was still the obedient daughter who'd do anything to avoid disappointing you. But that girl died the night you sold her. What's standing here now is something you helped create. Something harder, more ruthless. And I want you to remember that every time you think about coming back. She stepped back and nodded to Damien. He released Marcus, who collapsed to the floor coughing. You have 1 hour to leave this estate. Clara holstered her pistol. If you ever return, I'll have you killed. Not arrested, not banished. Killed. Do you understand? Marcus looked up at her with something that might have been recognition, seeing clearly for the first time what his choices had created. His daughter had learned cruelty from necessity, had become exactly hard enough to survive in places he'd thrown her. I understand. The words came out broken, defeated. Good. Now get out of my home. Marcus stumbled to his feet and staggered toward the exit where his hired thugs had already disappeared. He paused at the door and looked back one final time. I'm sorry, Clara. For what it's worth, it's not worth anything. But Clara felt no satisfaction saying it, just exhausted recognition that some relationships couldn't be salvaged, only ended cleanly. Goodbye, Father. He left. The door closed behind him with hollow finality. Clara stood in the massive hall, feeling the adrenaline drain from her system and leave behind bone-deep weariness. Her cheek throbbed where he'd struck her. She could taste blood. But more than the physical pain, she felt the last threads connecting her to her old life finally sever. There was no going back now, no family to return to, no life outside Blackthorn Manor. She'd burned those bridges and watched them collapse into ash. Damien's hand found hers and squeezed gently. You didn't have to let him live. Yes, I did. Clara squeezed back. Killing him would have made me exactly what this family expects, ruthless without purpose. I wanted him alive to spread the story, to warn anyone else who thinks they can use me. Strategic mercy. Damien's voice held approval. You're learning. I had a good teacher. They stood there in silence until the sound of boots on marble announced incoming guards. The captain approached and offered a shallow bow. Your Grace, we've secured all the conspirators, 18 total as you specified. What are your orders? Damien glanced at Clara. She realized he was actually asking her opinion, treating her as an equal partner in decisions about the estate. Something shifted in her chest that might have been the beginning of trust. Strip them of titles and properties. Clara kept her voice firm. Distribute their assets among the loyal family members and staff. I want everyone in this manor to see that loyalty is rewarded and betrayal destroys everything, and the conspirators themselves. The captain's expression was carefully neutral. Exile. Damien's voice was cold. Permanent banishment from the estate and all Blackthorn holdings. They can survive on whatever scraps they can gather elsewhere. That's more mercy than they deserve. Mercy sends a message. Clara met the captain's eyes. We're strong enough to show it. Fear keeps people in line temporarily. Calculated mercy creates lasting loyalty. The captain nodded and left to execute the orders. More boots echoed through the halls as guards moved to implement the purge. Clara could hear distant shouts and protests as family members were forcibly removed from rooms they'd occupied for decades. The Blackthorn Empire was being fundamentally restructured, and she was helping design it. We need to address the household staff. Damien moved toward his study. Mrs. Thorne's betrayal means we can't trust the existing management structure. You're going to fire her. I'm going to make an example that ensures the next housekeeper understands the cost of disloyalty. They entered the study to find Mrs. Thorne already waiting, flanked by 2 guards. The woman's usual severity had cracked. She looked older, frightened, like she'd finally realized the game she'd been playing had consequences. Your Grace. Her voice shook. I can explain. You sided with conspirators planning to murder me and my wife. Damien sat behind his desk with the casual authority of someone pronouncing judgment. What explanation could possibly matter? They promised me a better position, more authority. Mrs. Thorne's hands twisted together. I've served this family for 30 years and watched you concentrate all power in yourself. It wasn't fair. Fair. Clara heard herself laugh. You think fairness exists in this family? I thought change was necessary. Change is fine. Treason is unforgivable. Damien's fingers drummed against the desk. You helped plan our deaths. That's not political maneuvering, that's murder. I never wanted you dead. Mrs. Thorne's composure finally shattered. I just wanted a voice in how this estate operated, a say in decisions. Then you should have asked instead of conspiring. Clara studied the woman who'd been so cold and dismissive during her first weeks here. Now she looked pathetic, desperate, human in all the weakest ways. You gambled on the wrong side and lost. That's not injustice. That's consequences. Damien stood and moved to the window, his back to Mrs. Thorne like she wasn't worth facing directly. You're fired, effective immediately. You have 2 hours to gather personal belongings. Anything else stays, and you'll receive no references, no severance, nothing. You can't. Mrs. Thorne's voice rose with panic. I've given 3 decades to this family, and you ended that service by helping plan our execution. Damien's tone was flat. You're fortunate I'm letting you leave with your life. Don't test my patience further. The guards escorted her out. Her protests echoed down the hallway until distance swallowed them. Clara watched Damien's reflection in the window and saw exhaustion etched into every line of his body. How many more betrayals do you think we'll uncover? She moved to stand beside him. Dozens, probably. Damien's smile was bitter. Treachery runs deep in this family. We've just started excavating. Then we keep digging until we hit bedrock, or until we dig so deep the whole structure collapses on us. Clara took his hand and felt him grip back with intensity that suggested he was drowning and she was the only solid thing left. We survived last night. We'll survive whatever comes next. Damien turned to face her fully. In the morning light, his eyes looked less cold and more haunted, like he'd been carrying weight alone for so long that sharing it felt impossible even when he desperately wanted to. I'm not good at this, at trusting people, at letting anyone close enough to matter. Neither am I. Clara reached up to touch his face. We're both disasters. Maybe that's why this works, or why it's doomed to fail. Only one way to find out. She kissed him and felt him kiss back with desperate intensity, like they were both trying to prove something. That connection was possible even after everything that had tried to destroy it.
that two people ground down by cruelty could still find something worth protecting in each other. The kiss broke when shouting erupted from somewhere in the manor. Close. Getting closer. Damien pulled his pistol in one smooth motion and moved toward the door. Clara followed with her own weapon drawn. Whatever new crisis had arrived, they'd face it together. They emerged into the hallway to find guards running toward the east wing. Smoke was beginning to seep through gaps around doors. Not again. Damien's voice was ice. Another fire. They ran toward the smoke with guards forming around them. The east wing housed the family archives, centuries of documents, ledgers, evidence of every business transaction and political alliance the Blackthorns had ever made. Destroying it would cripple their ability to prove ownership and legitimacy. Someone was making one final desperate move. The archive room door hung open, smoke billowing out. Guards rushed in with water, but Claire could already see the damage was catastrophic. Flames consumed shelves of irreplaceable documents. Papers turned to ash and floated through the air like snow. Damien stood frozen in the doorway. Clara saw his face go completely blank. The kind of blankness that preceded either shutdown or explosion. Who was supposed to be guarding this room? His voice was deadly quiet. A guard captain stepped forward, pale with fear. "Thomas, Your Grace." "But he's missing. We found his post abandoned. Find him, now!" Guards scattered to search. Clara moved closer to Damien and felt the rage radiating off him in waves. This fire wasn't just destruction of property. It was erasure of history, proof of legitimacy, everything his father had built. "We can rebuild the documents," she kept her voice low. "Reconstruct from other sources. Some of those papers were originals dating back 200 years. Damien's hands clenched into fists. Contracts with the crown, land grants, evidence of every legal claim to our holdings. Without them, half our business partners can dispute agreements, and we'll spend decades in court proving ownership. Then we spend decades. We survived worse in the last 24 hours. This was planned, coordinated." Damien turned away from the burning room. Whoever orchestrated this knew exactly what documents to destroy for maximum damage. One of the conspirators, or someone we haven't identified yet. Shouting erupted from a distant corridor. The guards had found something. Claire and Damien ran toward the commotion and found Thomas the guard being dragged from a storage closet. He was barely conscious. Blood matted his hair where someone had struck him from behind. What happened? Damien crouched beside the injured man. "Don't know, Your Grace." Thomas's words slurred. "Someone came up behind me. Next thing I remember is waking up in that closet. Did you see who?" "No. Just felt the blow. Then nothing." Damien stood and addressed the captain. "Get him to the physician, and double guards on every critical area of the manor. Whoever did this is still inside." The realization hit Clara like ice water. The arsonist wasn't an external threat. They were trapped inside Blackthorn Manor with someone willing to destroy everything rather than see Damien and Clara keep control. "We need to gather everyone." Clara's mind was already working through logistics. Every person in this manor accounted for and visible. Anyone missing gets hunted down. That's over 200 staff and remaining family members. Then we'd better start now. They organized quickly despite the chaos. Guards went room by room ordering everyone to the main hall. Servants and family members assembled in confused clusters. The smoke from the archive fire drifted through upper windows like a shroud. Clara stood on the raised platform at the hall's front and counted faces, looking for anyone who seemed too calm, too satisfied. Guilty people had tells if you knew how to read them. Damien addressed the assembled crowd with cold authority that demanded attention. "Someone in this room just committed arson against the state archives. They attacked a guard and destroyed irreplaceable documents. That person will be found, and when they are, the consequences will be severe." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, people exchanging glances, looking for the guilty party among familiar faces. Until the arsonist is identified, no one leaves this manor. Guards will be stationed at every exit. Anyone attempting to flee will be considered complicit. "You can't imprison us all," someone shouted from the back. "We have rights. You have whatever rights I grant you." Damien's voice cut through the protests. "This is my estate. My rules. Cooperate or face consequences." Clara scanned the crowd and caught movement in her peripheral vision, a servant edging toward a side door. Not running, just subtle repositioning that screamed guilt. "There," she pointed. Guards moved instantly.
The servant broke and ran, but they caught him within seconds, dragged him back, struggling and shouting denials. I didn't do anything. The man's eyes were wild with panic. I swear. Then why run? Damien descended from the platform with predatory calm. I got scared, that's all. Search him. The guards found matches and a small vial of accelerant hidden in the servant's coat. Evidence so damning even his panicked denials couldn't explain it away. Damien's expression went absolutely cold. Who paid you? No one. The servant was crying now. I found those. They're not mine. Last chance. Damien pulled his pistol and pressed it against the man's temple. Who? Paid. You. The servant crumpled, sobbing, broken. Lord Sebastian, before he was banished. He paid me to wait 3 days, then burn the archives. Said it would hurt you worse than killing you ever could. Clara felt rage and bitter understanding flood through her simultaneously. Sebastian getting one final revenge from exile, destroying the estate's legitimacy even if he couldn't claim it himself. Pure spite dressed as strategy. Where is Sebastian now? Damien didn't move the gun. I don't know. He left after you banished him. I swear that's all I know. Damien pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the massive hall. The servant's body dropped. Blood spread across expensive marble in growing pools. The crowd stood frozen in absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. Clara's ears rang from the gunshot, but she didn't look away from the body. Didn't show shock or horror. This was the cost of survival in the Blackthorn world. Immediate brutal consequences for betrayal. Let this be perfectly clear. Damien's voice carried to every corner of the hall. Anyone else harboring plans for sabotage or revenge will end the same way. There is no mercy for traitors. No second chances. Only death. He holstered his pistol and turned to the guards. Remove the body. Clean this mess. Everyone else back to their duties. The crowd dispersed quickly. Servants practically fled. Family members retreated to their rooms with new understanding that the rules had fundamentally changed. Clara stood beside Damien as the hall emptied and felt something settle in her chest. Not acceptance exactly, but recognition that they'd crossed a line together. Become people capable of execution without trial, of brutal justice delivered in seconds. The girl she'd been 3 weeks ago would have been horrified. The woman she'd become understood it was necessary. You didn't have to kill him, she kept her voice neutral. We could have used him to track Sebastian. He was a liability. Damien watched guards carry the body away. And an example. Fear works when people see consequences are immediate and absolute. Is that what we are now? Clara met his eyes. Rulers through terror. We're survivors using whatever tools keep us alive. Damien's jaw was tight. If that makes us monsters, then so be it. I'd rather be a living monster than a dead saint. The word should have horrified her. Instead, Clara felt grim agreement settle over her like armor. They'd both been pushed past the point where conventional morality applied. Now they operated on survival calculus. Do what's necessary. Eliminate threats. Protect what's yours with absolute ruthlessness. And somehow, in that shared brutality, they'd found partnership. Not pretty, not romantic, but functional in ways nothing soft could be in this environment. We need to find Sebastian. Claire's voice was steady. He's not done. This fire was planned to execute after his exile. That means he has other contingencies in place. Agreed. Damien moved toward his study. I'll send trackers. He can't have gotten far. And when they find him, we end this permanently. Clara followed him through corridors still smelling of smoke and blood. The manor felt different now. Less like a prison and more like a fortress under siege. Every shadow potentially hiding enemies. Every loyal face potentially concealing betrayal. They reached the study to find a letter waiting on the desk. Neither of them had been in the room since leaving to address the fire. Someone had delivered it in the chaos. Damien picked up the envelope and Clara saw his expression shift. Not fear exactly, but recognition of a new threat. What is it? He broke the seal and read in silence, then handed it to Clara without comment. The letter was brief and written in elegant script. Your Grace, congratulations on surviving your family's attempt to remove you. Impressive work. Unfortunately, your victory has created complications for certain business partners who preferred the previous arrangement. We represent interests who found the conspiracy's leadership more amenable to profitable agreements. Since you've eliminated them, we must adjust our approach. You have 48 hours to cede control of the Blackthorn shipping operations to our designated representatives. Refuse, and we will destroy every warehouse, every ship, every asset until you have nothing left but the manor itself. This is not negotiation. This is notification of consequences. We'll be in touch. The letter was unsigned, but the threat was clear enough. Someone with significant resources had been working with the conspirators. Now that those conspirators were gone, the outside force was making demands directly. Clara set the letter down carefully. So we stopped the internal threat only to inherit their external partners. Apparently. Damien's voice was grim. And whoever these people are, they're confident enough to make ultimatums. Can we afford to lose the shipping operations? Not without crippling the entire estate economy. Those operations generate half our annual income. Damien moved to a map on the wall showing trade routes. Without them, we'd have to liquidate properties just to maintain basic operations. Then we fight. Against an enemy we can't identify. With resources we can't match. While still cleaning up a family conspiracy. Damien's laugh was hollow. We're stretched too thin as it is. So what's the alternative? We surrender and hope they're satisfied with shipping. Clara shook her head. You know they won't stop there. Give them one concession and they'll demand another. Then another. Until we're puppets in our own estate. I know. Damien stared at the map like it might reveal answers. I just don't know if we have the strength to fight on this many fronts. Clara studied her husband and saw the weight of leadership crushing him. He'd spent years maintaining control through fear and intimidation. Now the foundation was crumbling, and he was desperately trying to hold together an empire that wanted to collapse. She recognized that desperation, that bone-deep exhaustion of fighting battles on every side while knowing you can't afford to lose even one. And she made a decision. We don't fight on every front. Clara moved to stand beside him. We consolidate, abandon positions we can't defend, and fortify what matters most. You're talking about retreat. I'm talking about strategy. Clara pointed to the map. These shipping routes through the eastern territories, they're profitable but require constant protection. Too many vulnerabilities. But the western routes are shorter, more defensible. We focus resources there and let the eastern operations go. That's millions in lost revenue. Millions we'd lose anyway when these mysterious partners destroy our warehouses. Clara traced her finger along the western routes. Better to control the retreat than have it forced on us. We consolidate to defensible positions. Build from strength instead of spreading ourselves too thin trying to hold everything. Damien studied the map with new focus, his mind already working through logistics. We'd need to move inventory, redirect shipping contracts, probably lose some business partners in the transition. Lose the weak partners, the ones who valued our previous leadership. Clara felt certainty settle into her bones. The strong ones will adapt, and new partners who respect our current control will emerge. You're talking about fundamentally restructuring the family business. I'm talking about survival. The old structure got us here. Maybe it's time to burn it down and build something new. Damien turned to face her fully. In his eyes, she saw recognition and something that might have been hope. Not the soft, hopeful kind. The desperate kind that appears when you're drowning and someone offers a different way forward. This could destroy us. We're already being destroyed. Clara met his gaze steadily. At least this way we control how it happens. They stood there in the smoke-damaged study surrounded by maps of an empire under siege. Two people who'd been forced together by circumstances and stayed together by choice. Not because they loved each other, love was still too foreign a concept for either of them, but because they'd become partners in the truest sense. Equals fighting the same battle. Damien's hand found hers and gripped tight. All right, we consolidate, restructure, burn down the old empire and build something that can't be destroyed as easily. Clara squeezed back. Together. The word hung between them, a promise and a threat, and a declaration all at once. Outside the study windows, Clara could see smoke still rising from the archive fire, could hear guards moving through hallways, could feel the weight of 200 people whose lives depended on the decisions made in this room. She thought about the frightened girl who'd arrived at Blackthorn Manor 3 weeks ago. The one who'd believed she was a victim with no agency. That girl was gone. Burned away by necessity and reforged into someone who could stand beside a duke and plan the restructuring of an empire without flinching. The transformation had cost her everything soft, everything gentle, everything she'd been raised to believe made her valuable. But it had given her something more precious than softness. It had given her power. control. The ability to shape her own survival instead of waiting for someone else to decide her fate. And standing here with Damien's hand in hers, Clara realized she'd make the same trade again in a heartbeat. The study door burst open and guards rushed in. "Your Grace!" The captain's face was pale. "We have a situation at the main gate." "What kind of situation?" "Armed riders. At least 30. They're demanding entry and they're not being subtle about the consequences if we refuse." The mysterious partners hadn't waited 48 hours. They'd come immediately to demonstrate they meant business. Clara and Damien exchanged glances. No words necessary, they'd made their choice. Now came the test of whether they were strong enough to survive it. Damien pulled his pistol and checked the ammunition. Clara did the same. Then they walked toward the manor entrance together. Outside the gates, 30 armed riders sat on horses arranged in attack formation. Their leader was a woman in expensive riding clothes, her face hidden behind a veil that somehow made her more intimidating. She raised one gloved hand and the riders went silent. "Duke Blackthorn," her voice carried across the distance. "We've come for your answer." "You'll have it." Damien's voice was steel. "The answer is no. Now leave my property before I have you removed." The veiled woman laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "You're in no position to make demands. We have 30 armed professionals. You have maybe a dozen guards scattered throughout a manor still recovering from internal purges. The math doesn't favor you. Numbers aren't everything." Clara stepped forward to stand beside Damien. "We've survived assassination attempts and family conspiracies in the last week. You think 30 riders will succeed where dozens of internal enemies failed?" The woman's attention shifted to Clara. "The new Duchess. How charming. Tell me, girl, do you understand what you've married into? The violence, the brutality, the endless war. Better than you think." Clara's voice was cold. "I've become part of it. Have you?" The woman urged her horse closer to the gate. "Then you understand that this ends one of two ways. Either you surrender what we want peacefully, or we take it by force and burn everything else to ash. Choose wisely." Damien raised his pistol and fired. The shot took the rider directly beside the veiled woman. The man toppled from his horse screaming. Blood sprayed across expensive saddles. The riders erupted into chaos, weapons drawn, horses rearing. "That's my answer," Damien's voice carried across the shouting. "Now get off my land before I kill all of you." The veiled woman brought her horse under control and stared at Damien with what Clara imagined was shock behind that veil. No one had expected him to fire first, to escalate immediately. But that was the difference between people who threatened violence and people who lived with it. Damien didn't bluff, didn't negotiate. He just acted. "You just started a war." The woman's voice shook with rage. "No." Clara felt cold certainty flood through her. "You started it when you sent that letter. We're just finishing it." The woman wheeled her horse around and the riders retreated beyond the gate, but Clara could feel them regrouping, preparing for assault. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Damien lowered his pistol and turned to the guards. "Seal the manor. Every entrance, every window. Anyone not currently inside stays out. Anyone inside who tries to leave gets shot." The guards scattered to execute orders. Clara watched the riders through the gate and felt her heartbeat settle into combat rhythm. Steady, controlled, ready. This was it, the final test. 30 professional fighters against a skeleton crew of guards protecting a manor still reeling from internal purges. They were outnumbered, outgunned, exhausted, and they had absolutely no intention of surrendering. Damien's hand found hers one more time. Ready for war. Clara looked at the approaching riders, at the manor behind them, full of people depending on their leadership, at the man beside her who'd become partner and ally in the truest sense. She thought about survival and sacrifice, about becoming exactly hard enough to protect what mattered, about the price of power and whether it was worth paying. Then she raised her pistol and smiled without warmth. "Let them come." The riders charged. The first wave hit the gates like thunder made flesh. 30 riders crashed against iron with weapons drawn and fury driving them forward. Clara fired twice before the recoil jarred her shoulder hard enough to bruise. One rider fell, then another, but the rest kept coming with the kind of momentum that suggested they'd done this before. Professional violence executed with precision. Damien stood beside her firing with mechanical efficiency. Each shot deliberate, each one finding its mark. But even perfect aim couldn't overcome mathematics. They were killing the enemy faster than seemed possible, and it still wasn't enough. The gates buckled under concentrated assault. Iron screamed as hinges gave way. Clara watched their first line of defense collapse and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear exactly, just recognition that survival would require more than they might have left to give. "Fall back!" Damien's voice cut through the chaos. "Into the manor. Now!" They retreated with guards forming a protective corridor. The riders poured through the broken gates like water through a dam. Clara fired over her shoulder without looking, heard someone scream, kept moving. The manor's entrance became a choke point, narrow enough that numbers mattered less than positioning. Guards took defensive positions behind overturned furniture and marble pillars. Clara crouched behind a statue of some long-dead Blackthorn ancestor and reloaded with shaking hands. Damien appeared beside her, breathing hard. Blood streaked his face from a cut above his eye. His shirt was torn, but his hand stayed steady as he checked his ammunition. "We can't hold this position long." His voice was clinical. Assessing. "They'll flank us through the side entrances, then we make them pay for every inch." Clara rose and fired at movement in the doorway. The shot went wide but forced the attackers back momentarily. "Buy time until we figure out what they actually want. They want us dead. What else matters? People who want you dead don't send 30 riders and negotiate first." Clara ducked as return fire shattered the statue above her head. Marble fragments rained down like hail. "They want something we have. Something they can't get if we're corpses." Damien processed this while firing 3 shots in rapid succession. All 3 found targets. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from combat mode to strategic calculation. "The shipping operations. They need someone alive to transfer control legally. Otherwise, the assets get tied up in probate for years, so we're worth more alive than dead." Clara felt pieces clicking into place, but only if we're broken enough to surrender, which means this assault is theater. Damien's smile was sharp and cold. "They're trying to terrify us into compliance. Is it working? Absolutely, but I'm too stubborn to let fear make my decisions." Clara laughed despite the circumstances, despite the bullets and blood and very real possibility they'd both die in the next hour. Something about Damien's absolute refusal to bend even when breaking was the smart choice, made her feel less alone in her own ruthless determination. The attackers regrouped for another push. Clara counted heads and recognized the tactical problem immediately. Even with the choke point advantage, they were being ground down. Guards fell, ammunition ran low, exhaustion was setting in. They needed to change the dynamic, or they'd lose through simple attrition. Clara grabbed Damien's arm. "The veiled woman. She's the leader. If we take her out, the rest might retreat. And how do you propose we reach her when she's surrounded by armed professionals?" "We don't reach her." Clara's mind was racing through possibilities. "We make her come to us." "By doing what?" "By giving her what she thinks she wants." Damien studied Clara's face like he was trying to read a language he'd never fully learned. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. "Tell me the plan." Clara outlined it quickly while gunfire echoed through the hall. It was risky, borderline suicidal, exactly the kind of desperate gamble people made when conventional options had run out. Damien listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for several long seconds. "That's insane." "I know. It might actually work. I know that too." His smile was genuine this time. Not cold calculation, but real appreciation for matched ruthlessness. "All right, we do it your way. But if this kills us both, I'm blaming you in whatever afterlife we end up in." "Deal." They signaled the guard captain and explained the plan. The man's expression suggested he thought they'd both lost their minds, but he'd also seen enough of their leadership to know that insanity sometimes worked when sanity failed. The captain gathered the remaining guards and positioned them according to Clara's instructions. Then Damien stood and raised his voice to carry through the hall. "Hold fire! We're calling a truce." The attackers stopped shooting. Suspicious silence filled the space where violence had been. Clara could feel them calculating whether this was genuine surrender or trap. The veiled woman rode her horse through the shattered gates and into the manor's entrance hall. Bold move, arrogant, but Clara had counted on that arrogance. "So," the woman's voice echoed against marble and blood, "you've decided to be reasonable. We've decided not to die pointlessly." Damien lowered his pistol but didn't drop it. "You want the shipping operations? Fine, we'll negotiate transfer of control. Just like that. You'll surrender what you've fought so hard to keep. I'll trade what I can't defend for what I can." Damien's tone was flat.
Cold pragmatism. That's not surrender. That's survival. The woman dismounted and approached slowly. Her riders stayed mounted, but Clara saw their weapons lower slightly. Good. The trap was working. Smart man. The woman stopped 10 feet from Damien. Perhaps you're not as foolish as your family believed. My family is dead or exiled. Their opinions don't matter anymore. No. I suppose they don't. The woman reached up to remove her veil, and Clara felt shock ripple through her. The face beneath was familiar, younger than expected, with features that looked almost kind until you noticed the absolute coldness in her eyes. Elizabeth Blackthorne smiled without warmth. Hello, Damien. Miss me. Clara watched Damien's face drain of color, watched his hands go slack with shock so complete it overrode years of controlled discipline. His first wife, the woman who'd allegedly died in a fall from the North Tower 3 years ago, standing in his entrance hall very much alive and leading an armed assault. You're dead. Damien's voice came out broken, fractured. I found your body. You found a body. Elizabeth's smile widened. One of many unfortunate girls who resembled me, dressed in my clothes, thrown from my favorite tower. The investigators were very thorough in confirming my identity. Why? The word came out like Damien was choking on it. Because you were crushing me. Elizabeth moved closer, and Clara saw madness dancing in those cold eyes. Your rules, your control, your absolute need to dominate everything around you. I couldn't breathe in this place, so I left the only way you'd never follow. By dying. I mourned you. Damien's hands were shaking. I spent 3 years believing I'd failed to protect you. Good. Elizabeth's voice turned sharp. You should have suffered, the way I suffered every day locked in this gilded prison, treated like decoration, like property. Never allowed to have opinions or agency or any life beyond what you permitted. I gave you everything. You gave me a cage and called it generosity. Clara watched this confrontation unfold and felt pieces clicking into place. Elizabeth hadn't just faked her death. She'd spent 3 years building resources and alliances, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The conspiracy, the fires, the external pressure, all of it orchestrated by a woman everyone believed was dead. It was brilliant and horrifying in equal measure. So what now? Clara heard herself speak, and both Elizabeth and Damien turned toward her. You've revealed yourself, destroyed your advantage. What's the end game? The end game is watching him lose everything. Elizabeth's attention fixed on Clara with predatory interest. Starting with you, the new wife, the replacement. Does he treat you better than he treated me? Or have you learned the same lessons about cages and control? He's learning. Clara kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. We both are. How touching. Elizabeth pulled a pistol from her coat, but ultimately irrelevant. You're both going to die. This manor will burn, and I'll take what's left of the Blackthorne fortune and disappear while the world thinks I'm still a ghost. Except for one problem. Clara moved her hand slowly toward her own weapon. You're standing in the exact position I need you to be. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. What are you? The floor beneath her feet gave way. The trapdoor was old, part of the manor's original defensive design from centuries ago when noble houses needed quick ways to dispose of unwanted guests. Claire had found it while exploring weeks ago and filed the information away as potentially useful. Now it served its purpose perfectly. Elizabeth dropped through the opening with a scream that cut off abruptly when she hit bottom, 15 feet straight down into the old wine cellar. The fall wouldn't kill her, but it would hurt badly enough to incapacitate. The riders erupted into chaos. Some fired. Others tried to reach the trapdoor, but the guards were already moving. Damien had recovered from his shock and was firing with brutal efficiency. Clara shot the nearest rider and watched him fall. Then another. The narrow hallway became a killing ground. Riders couldn't maneuver properly on horseback, couldn't retreat without trampling each other. Within minutes, it was over. Bodies littered the marble floor. Some riders had fled. The rest were dead or dying. Clara lowered her pistol and felt adrenaline drain away to leave behind shaking hands and the metallic taste of terror. Check the cellar. Damien's voice was hoarse. Make sure she's contained. Guards descended into the trapdoor with ropes. They emerged minutes later dragging Elizabeth. She was conscious but clearly in pain, her leg bent at an angle that suggested broken bones.
Blood matted her hair. She looked up at Damien with pure hatred. "You think this is over?" She spat blood. "I have resources. Allies. People who want you destroyed as much as I do.
Then they can join you in exile." Damien crouched beside his first wife. His expression was emptier than Clara had ever seen it. "You faked your death to hurt me, spent 3 years plotting revenge, and in the end you still failed. That's not tragedy, Elizabeth. That's just pathetic. I loved you." Elizabeth's voice broke. "I gave you everything and you crushed me with your need to control."
"You gave me nothing but lies." Damien stood. "And now you get to live with the consequences. Take her to the old tower. Lock her in the room where I thought she died. Let her spend however long she has left contemplating irony." The guards dragged her away, still screaming. Clara watched until the sounds faded, then turned to survey the damage. Her home looked like a battlefield. Blood and bodies and broken furniture everywhere. The cost of survival written in violence across expensive marble. Damien stood alone in the center of the carnage. His shoulders were rigid, but Clara could see him shaking. The shock of Elizabeth's return combined with the brutality of the last hour finally overwhelming even his legendary control. Clara approached carefully and touched his arm. He flinched like he'd been struck. "Don't." His voice was raw. "Please don't be kind right now. I can't handle kindness. Then I'll be honest instead." Clara moved to stand in front of him. "That was the worst hour of my life, and I need you to hold yourself together for approximately 5 more minutes until we can fall apart somewhere private." Damien's laugh was broken. Always practical. Someone has to be. He pulled her into an embrace that felt more like desperation than affection. Clara held him back with equal intensity. Two people who'd survived hell clinging to each other because letting go meant confronting what they'd become. The manor cleanup took days. Bodies removed, blood scrubbed from marble, broken gates replaced. The physical damage was extensive but repairable. The psychological cost was harder to calculate. Clara stood in Damien's study 1 week after the assault and reviewed the accounting. 18 guards dead. 32 attackers killed. Elizabeth imprisoned in the North Tower under constant guard. Sebastian still missing, but presumably fled far enough that pursuit was pointless. The conspiracy was ended. The external threat neutralized. The Blackthorn estate remained under their control. Victory tasted like ashes. Damien entered carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey that probably cost more than Clara's childhood home. He poured without asking and handed her one. To survival. His voice was flat. To whatever comes next. They drank in silence. The whiskey burned going down, but Clara welcomed the pain. Something real to focus on besides the numbness that had settled over her since the battle ended. "I'm sending Elizabeth away." Damien stared into his glass. "There's a sanatorium in Scotland. Secure. Remote. She'll live out her days there under medical supervision. You're showing mercy. I'm removing a problem without creating a martyr. There's a difference." Clara studied his profile and saw exhaustion etched into every line. Damien had always carried weight, but now it looked like it might finally crush him. The revelation of Elizabeth's betrayal combined with everything else had cracked something fundamental in his armor. "Talk to me." She set down her glass. "Really talk. Not strategic assessment, not damage control, just honest conversation about how you're feeling." "I don't know how." Damien's hands were shaking. "I've spent so long controlling everything, managing threats, staying 3 moves ahead, and it still wasn't enough. My dead wife came back to destroy me and I never saw it coming. You couldn't have known. That's the problem. There will always be things I can't know, threats I can't predict. People I trust who will betray me. How do I build anything lasting when the foundation is this unstable?" "You build with someone else." Clara moved to stand beside him. "Share the weight, accept that you can't control everything, and maybe that's not actually a weakness. Sharing control means giving someone power to hurt you." "I already have that power." Clara's voice was gentle. "I could destroy you in a dozen ways if I wanted to. But I don't, because we're stronger together than separate." Damien turned to face her, and Clara saw tears tracking down his face. She'd never seen him cry, hadn't thought him capable of it. But there they were, proof that underneath all the ice was someone who'd been hurt so badly he'd built walls to survive. "I don't know how to do this." His voice broke. How to be vulnerable. How to trust. "Elizabeth taught me that loving someone just gives them ammunition." Elizabeth was sick. Clara reached up to touch his face.
and cruel. And she weaponized your love because she was too broken to value it. But I'm not her, and you're not the same man you were 3 years ago. How do you know? Because the man from 3 years ago would have executed Elizabeth immediately. You're sending her to medical care instead. That's growth even if it doesn't feel like it. Damien pulled Clara into a kiss that tasted like whiskey and desperation, and the beginning of something that might eventually become trust. She kissed him back and felt her own walls starting to crack. Two people who'd been ground down by cruelty finding small moments of gentleness in the ruins. When they broke apart, Damien rested his forehead against hers. I'm terrified of losing you. The admission came out quiet, vulnerable. Everything I've lost, everyone I've cared about. My mother died when I was young. My father destroyed himself with paranoia. Elizabeth betrayed me so completely, I thought grief would kill me. What if you're next? What if I'm not? Clara's hands cupped his face. What if we actually survive this and build something that doesn't require constant warfare to maintain? That's not how this family works. Then maybe we change how the family works. Clara felt certainty settling into her bones. We've already purged the worst elements, restructured the business, survived assassination attempts and armed assault. What's one more impossible task like transforming a legacy of cruelty into something functional? You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's just necessary. Damien studied her face, and Clara saw the exact moment he decided to trust her. Really trust her. Not strategic alliance or temporary partnership, but genuine belief that she might actually stay. All right, his voice was rough. We try. We build something different. And if it fails, at least we'll fail together. That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me. My standards for romance are admittedly low. Clara laughed and felt some of the darkness lift. Not gone. Never fully gone. But manageable. The weight distributed between two people instead of crushing one. The following months were brutal in entirely different ways. Rebuilding an estate required different skills than defending it. Clara threw herself into the work with intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. She met with business partners and renegotiated contracts, established new trade routes and dissolved unprofitable ones, transformed the manor from fortress to functional headquarters. Damien worked beside her, learning to delegate instead of controlling everything himself, learning to trust staff and accept that mistakes were survivable. The transformation was slow and painful, but undeniable. One evening, 6 months after Elizabeth's assault, Clara stood in the garden watching winter sunset paint the sky in shades of fire. The manor behind her looked different now, less imposing, more lived in. They'd opened sections that had been closed for decades, hired new staff to replace the conspirators, even started hosting small social events to rebuild relationships with allied families. It was exhausting and terrifying and somehow exactly what Clara needed. Damien found her standing among dormant rose bushes wrapped in a coat against the cold. He didn't speak, just stood beside her and watched the sunset together. I've been thinking. Claire's breath misted in the cold air. About what we've built here. What it cost. Regrets. Some. She turned to face him. I lost my innocence in this place. Became someone capable of ordering executions and orchestrating battles. That's not who I thought I'd be. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. Clara chose her words carefully. I'm stronger now, more capable, but I'm also harder, less trusting. I see threats everywhere, and my first instinct is always violence. You've adapted to survive in a brutal environment. That's not weakness. But what happens when the environment changes? When we've actually built something stable, do I become a liability? Someone too damaged to function in peace? Damien took her hand and squeezed gently. We're both damaged, both carrying scars we'll never fully heal from. But maybe that's okay. Maybe survival isn't about recovering who we were. Maybe it's about accepting who we've become and building forward from there. That's very philosophical for someone who claimed to have no capacity for introspection. I'm learning. Slowly. With significant help from someone who refuses to let me retreat into ice. Clara leaned against him and felt his arm wrap around her shoulders. They stood there as darkness fell and stars emerged. Two people who'd been forged in fire, learning to exist in the aftermath. I love you. Clara heard herself say it and felt shock ripple through her. She hadn't planned the words. They'd just emerged, true and terrifying. Damien went very still.
When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I don't know if I remember how to love, if I ever knew. But what I feel for you is the closest I've come to understanding what that word means. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. Not poetry, not grand declaration, just raw admission that he was trying, that she mattered enough for him to attempt something he'd believed himself incapable of. That's enough. Clara's voice was thick. We'll figure out the rest as we go. The winter passed into spring and the estate continued transforming. Catherine approached Clara one afternoon with a request to establish a school for staff children. Clara approved it immediately, and Catherine cried with gratitude. Small victories building towards something larger. Robert returned from exile broke and desperate. He begged for forgiveness and a chance to rebuild his position. Damien refused, but Clara intervened. She arranged a minor position in the textile operations. Far from power, but enough to survive. Robert proved surprisingly competent when actual work was required instead of scheming. Sebastian sent a letter from abroad. No apology, just acknowledgement that he'd lost and respect for how thoroughly he'd been outplayed. Damien burned the letter, but Clara noticed he kept the ashes. Some connection to family, worth preserving even in destruction. Mrs. Thorne wrote asking for a reference for new employment. Clara responded with brutal honesty about the woman's betrayal, but also acknowledgement of her decades of competent service before that. The reference was neither glowing nor damning, just accurate. Mrs. Thorne found work managing a smaller estate. Last Clara heard she was doing well. Marcus Vale died in a gambling house 8 months after his final visit to Blackthorn Manor. Clara received word via a brief letter from his solicitor. No funeral, no estate to settle. He died as he'd lived, alone and broke. Clara felt nothing when she read the news. No grief, no anger. Just empty recognition that some relationships truly were beyond salvage. 1 year after the assault, Clara stood in the manor library reorganizing shelves. They'd recovered what documents they could from the archive fire and commissioned new copies of destroyed records. The process was tedious but necessary. Damien found her among the books and pulled her into an embrace from behind. Come with me. I want to show you something. He led her through corridors to the North Tower. Clara hadn't been there since Elizabeth's imprisonment. The tower had been empty for months after Elizabeth's transfer to the sanatorium. Damien had ordered it locked and avoided. Now he unlocked the door and gestured for Clara to enter first. The room had been completely transformed. The prison cell aesthetic was gone. In its place was a study. Windows open to let in light, comfortable furniture, shelves for books, a desk facing the view. What is this? Clara turned to find Damien watching her carefully. Yours, if you want it. A space completely separate from my control, where you can work or think or just exist without my shadow over everything. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. The gesture was more meaningful than expensive jewelry or grand declarations. He was giving her autonomy, space, recognition that she needed room to be herself instead of just his duchess. It's perfect. She pulled him into a kiss that conveyed gratitude and affection and the beginning of real love. Thank you. You've earned it. Damien's voice was soft. You've transformed this estate, helped me become someone I can actually live with being. Giving you a room seems inadequate by comparison. It's not the room. Clara touched his face gently. It's what it represents, trust, partnership, actual equality instead of just lip service to the concept. They stood there in that transformed space while afternoon sun streamed through windows. Clara thought about the terrified girl who'd arrived at Blackthorn Manor over a year ago. That girl would never recognize who Clara had become. Wouldn't approve of the violence and ruthlessness, the calculated cruelty deployed in service of survival. But that girl also would never have survived what Clara had endured. Would never have built an empire or earned the respect of people who'd initially seen her as worthless. Would never have found partnership with someone equally damaged and equally determined to heal. Growth required sacrifice. Becoming stronger meant shedding weakness, even when that weakness was innocence and softness. Clara had paid that price, and standing here in her new study, she couldn't honestly say she regretted it. The alternative had been death or irrelevance. She'd chosen survival and transformation instead. That evening, they hosted a small dinner, just a handful of allies and staff who'd proven loyal. Catherine and her husband Richard, the guard captain who'd stood with them through the assault, and the young maid who'd served Clara since her first day. A few business partners who'd stuck with them through the restructuring. The conversation was easy, genuine. People who'd survived hell together, finding small joys in stability. Clara watched Damien laugh at something Richard said and felt her heart catch. He looked different when he relaxed, younger, less burdened. After dinner, Clara and Damien stood on the balcony overlooking the estate grounds. Spring had brought new growth, gardens blooming, trees heavy with leaves, everything alive and reaching toward light. "Do you think we're actually going to make this work?" Clara leaned against the railing. "Long term, building something that lasts, I think we have better odds than most." Damien stood beside her. "We've already survived what destroys most partnerships. The question is whether we can thrive in peace or if we only function in crisis. Only one way to find out." "True." Damien took her hand, "though I'm hoping for significantly fewer assassination attempts and armed assaults going forward." "Agreed." "My quota for dramatic near-death experiences is fulfilled for the next decade." They stood together as night fell and lights appeared across the estate. Staff returning to quarters, guards beginning night shifts, the ordinary rhythms of a functioning household. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, just life continuing. Clara thought about everything she'd learned in her time at Blackthorn Manor, about survival and sacrifice, about becoming hard enough to protect what mattered while staying soft enough to value connection, about the price of power and whether it was worth paying. The answer was complicated. Yes and no. Worth it for what she'd gained, but also mourning what she'd lost. Both truths existing simultaneously. That's what growth actually looked like. Not simple transformation from weak to strong, but complex evolution that preserved pieces worth keeping while discarding parts that no longer served. Clara had become ruthless when necessary while maintaining capacity for gentleness, had learned violence while retaining ability to choose peace. And standing here beside Damien, watching their estate settle into evening quiet, she realized something profound. They hadn't just survived. They'd built something worth defending. Not perfect, not innocent, but functional and increasingly humane. That was victory, not the dramatic kind from stories, the quiet kind that accumulated in small daily choices to be better than circumstances demanded. "I love you." Damien's voice broke the silence. "I know I said it badly before, but I'm trying to learn how to say it right. You've taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness, that trusting someone can make you stronger instead of exposing you to harm. I love you for that gift, for your strength, for staying when leaving would have been easier." Clara turned to face him fully and saw tears tracking down his face again, proof that the ice had finally melted enough to let real emotion through. "I love you too." Her voice was steady. "Not because I think you're perfect, because you're perfectly matched to who I've become. We're both broken in complementary ways, both ruthless enough to survive and soft enough to care about surviving together." Is that romantic? It's honest. Which matters more? Damien pulled her close, and they kissed while stars emerged overhead. Long and slow, not desperate or frantic, just connected. Two people who'd found each other in hell and decided to build heaven from the ashes. When they finally broke apart, Clara rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, strong and steady, alive. They were both alive despite everything that had tried to kill them. That alone felt like miracle enough. The years that followed weren't easy. Building something lasting never was. But Clara and Damien worked together through challenges that would have destroyed their earlier selves. They made mistakes and learned from them, fought and reconciled, grew individually and together. The Blackthorn estate transformed from fortress to home, from place of fear to place of measured hope. Not perfect, never perfect, but functional in ways that honored both their strength and their scars. And sometimes late at night, Clara would stand in her tower study and remember the terrified girl who'd arrived here expecting only cruelty. She'd mourn that girl's lost innocence while celebrating the woman she'd become. Both truths held simultaneously, both honored, because that was the real lesson Blackthorn Manor had taught her. Survival required transformation. But transformation didn't mean erasure. You could become someone new while respecting who you'd been. Could be ruthless and gentle, strong and vulnerable, broken and healing, all of it true, all of it necessary. Clara had entered this place as a pawn, a transaction designed to settle debts and strengthen alliances. She'd left that identity behind and become a player, then a partner. Finally, someone who understood that real power wasn't domination.
It was the strength to choose mercy when vengeance would be easier, to build when destruction was simpler, to love when isolation was safer. That understanding had cost her everything soft and innocent, but it had given her everything that mattered: agency, partnership, a life she'd chosen instead of one assigned to her. And standing in her study surrounded by books and possibilities, Clara Vale Blackthorne finally understood what her husband had meant all those months ago. Survival wasn't recovering who you were before trauma. It was accepting who you'd become because of it and building forward from there. She'd survived. They'd both survived. Now came the harder part, learning to thrive. Clara smiled and turned back to her work. Outside her window, the estate sprawled toward distant mountains. Inside her chest, something that might eventually become peace was taking root. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.